Chapter 43:19. After saying this, Ji Tianxing glanced at the celestial king coldly and contemptuously, then turned and left the hall. His back was as tall and stubborn as ever, but there was also a sense of desolation and loneliness. At this moment the hall was deathly silent. Everyone was stunned. Everyone knew that the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory was stubborn, upright. He was a man of virtue and prestige. But no one had expected him to be so stubborn. For the sake of his lifelong reputation he did not know how to compromise or endure. He directly said what was on his mind, tore off the tacit understanding between the ruler and his subjects, and forced both sides into a desperate situation. From the moment he said this, it was impossible for both sides to reconcile. On the other hand, his expression that was filled with disappointment, bleakness, and desolation fully displayed how disheartened he was and how he disregarded life and death. The most shocking thing was that the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory had revealed the truth. The so-called Imperial Guards were guarding the peaks and did not allow anyone to visit them. This led to the conflict between the territorial lords and the Imperial Guard captain, and then to the confrontation in the hall, where the Celestial King stripped the territorial lords of their military power. All of this was a show directed and arranged by the Celestial King himself. His purpose was to seize the military power of the territorial lords in a dignified way. Understanding this, the 5 territorial lords were suddenly enlightened. They were instantly filled with respect and admiration for the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory. They admired the wisdom of the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory. He had seen through the truth and had the courage to expose the despicable means of the Celestial King to his face. This was something they could not do. Therefore, the 5 territorial lords who had come to their senses were infected by the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory. They looked at each other, then looked firmly at the Celestial King and said in unison, "We will advance and retreat together with the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory. We are willing to hand over our military power. We only hope that the Divine King will be lenient and not ruin the Lord of the Cool Breeze territory's lifelong reputation. Return our innocence." After saying this, the 5 territorial lords took out their tiger soldier seals, threw them in the hall and turned to leave. Perhaps it was due to the influence of the realm Lord of Lightwind that they didn't show any attachment to power. They were especially proud and unyielding, and their postures were very free and easy. After they left the hall, God King Fingy, the inspector of the Forbidden Army, and the god generals looked at each other. The Celestial King, who had finally come to his senses, was so angry that his lungs were about to explode. His face was as black as the bottom of a pot as he roared furiously. "Bastard! Damnable bastard, you actually dare to look down on me like this. I directed and acted on my own, deliberately acting to seize their military power? Detestable old thing, how dare you frame me like this? Oh. Men, capture that old bastard Clearwind territorial lord. I want to behead him in public." Of course, Celestial King felt wronged and angry. He didn't do anything, but in the end he became a despicable person who directed and acted out his own plot to seize military power. However, the territorial lord of Clearwind had spoken so clearly and acted so fearlessly. Anyone who knew what had happened would believe the territorial lord of Clearwind's words and think that it was his plot. Even God King Fingy and the inspector of the Forbidden Army felt a little guilty. They secretly thought that this might really be the Celestial King's plot. After all, this was in line with Celestial King's usual style. Hearing the Celestial King's roar, the inspector of the Forbidden Army and the god generals acknowledged the order and immediately went to capture the territorial lord of Clearwind. However, God King Fingy was able to keep calm and quickly stopped them. "Wait. Your Excellency, please don't be foolish. You can't capture or kill the territorial lord of Clearwind. Now that he has been wronged, he is disheartened. If you behead him in public, I'm afraid it will be exactly what he wants. He could use his death to prove his innocence and preserve his reputation for the rest of his life. As for you, you will be labeled as a muddlehead." Hearing God King Fingy's reminder, the Celestial King calmed down. When he thought of the possible consequences, he could only suppress his anger and withdraw the order. However, his anger had not subsided. He asked unwillingly, "If I can't kill the territorial lord of Clearwind, do I have to swallow my anger and bear the stigma?" God King Fingy also had a headache. He frowned and thought for a while. Then he said, "I can't think of a good solution at the moment. However, you must not be rash. This matter needs to be considered at length. The Celestial King remained silent. He could only gnash his teeth and clench his fists so tightly that creaking sounds could be heard. At the same time, Ji Tianxing was standing in the square outside Dutian God Palace. Many Forbidden Army soldiers and more than 20 territorial lords were gathered around the square. These territorial lords were acquainted with him or were on good terms with the 5 territorial lords. Everyone had a deep or shallow relationship with each other. Previously, when they saw Ji Tianxing and the 5 territorial lords rushing to Dutian God Palace, they guessed that something big had happened. Therefore, they rushed over to check on the situation. Everything that had happened in the meeting hall, including the Celestial King's verdict and Ji Tianxing's unyielding words, was heard clearly by everyone. When Ji Tianxing walked to the square, more than 20 territorial lords came forward to welcome him. They all looked at him with complicated expressions. Some bowed and greeted him, expressing their respect and admiration. Some comforted him. Their expressions and emotions were also very disappointed and downcast. There were also some territorial lords who admired his character. They also expressed their grief and indignation against a common enemy. Immediately after, the 5 territorial lords also left the hall and came behind Ji Tianxing. Many territorial lords had witnessed their audacity to throw the tiger tally in the hall and give the Celestial King a hard time. Everyone was also full of admiration for the 5 of them. They hurriedly came forward to comfort and praise them. After the previous conflict, many territorial lords had unknowingly stood on the same side and were dissatisfied with the Celestial King. What happened today made these territorial lords completely disappointed in the Celestial King. They also hated the arrogant and despotic Forbidden Army even more. Ji Tianxing was very satisfied with the current outcome. He looked at the many territorial lords with a bleak expression. He smiled bitterly and said, "My colleagues, I've made a fool of myself. Perhaps I was a little impulsive and reckless today, but I would rather break than submit. I would rather die to prove my sincerity than suffer an unjust injustice and ruin my reputation. If the Celestial King wanted military power, why did he have to go through so much trouble and devise such dirty schemes? He only needed to say the word and I would have given him 2,000 soldiers. But if he wants to ruin my reputation, I would rather die than comply. In addition, everyone should go back and make preparations." Hearing this, many territorial lords were stunned. Someone asked doubtfully, "Senior Qingfeng, what do we need to prepare?" Ji Tianxing smiled and said, "Today's matter is only the beginning. The Celestial King went through so much trouble just to take back military power. I believe you all saw it. So, everyone should be tactful and obediently hand over military power. You can also be exempted from punishment and charges. Don't let the Celestial King go through the trouble of taking everyone's military power one by one. It's not good for anyone." When he finished speaking, all the territorial lords were dumbfounded. They burst into a burst of exclamations. Everyone's expression became very ugly. Chapter 43:20. Before Ji Tianxing pointed it out, many of the territorial lords were just grieving for the loss of their fellow territorial lords. They were all angry at the same enemy and sympathized with the territorial lord of Light Wind and the others. But after hearing Ji Tianxing's words, they finally understood the Celestial King's true motive. He did not want to take the military power of the territorial lord of Clear Wind and the others. He wanted to use them as an example to make an example out of them and take away the military power of all the other territorial lords. The 20 or so territorial lords instantly panicked. They believed the territorial lord of Clear Wind's words completely. But they could not be as righteous and proud as the territorial lord of Clear Wind. They could not give up their military power so easily and decisively to protect their chastity and reputation. Even though the 20 or so territorial lords each only had a few hundred soldiers under their command. However, those soldiers were their direct subordinates, the most loyal and reliable elites. If they were forced to hand over those elite soldiers, they would become commanders without an army in name and would have no power to speak of. Not only would they lose their confidence, but they would also lose their sense of security. Therefore, they could not give up their military power no matter what. If the Celestial King really wanted to use force to force them to hand over their soldiers, then they would rather betray him than submit. If the Celestial King was heartless, then don't blame them for being unrighteous. Similar thoughts flashed through the minds of all the territorial lords. They gritted their teeth in hatred. Originally, Ji Tianxing wanted to say a few more words to incite the territorial lords to resist. But the celestial king and supreme being Fingyi, who were in the meeting hall, heard the commotion in the square and his words. The celestial king was so angry that he almost went berserk. He immediately brought supreme being Fingyi and the others over to explain. Perhaps he would not be able to suppress his anger and order the arrest of Ji Tianxing. When Ji Tianxing saw that the situation wasn't good, he threw down a sentence and hurriedly left with the 5 region lords. Alright, I have to go back and explain to the soldiers. Everyone go and prepare as soon as possible. Many of the territorial lords heard this and felt even more conflicted. They whispered to each other angrily. Suddenly someone shouted, "Let's go. The celestial king is here." Many domain lords turned their heads and saw Empyrean God King storming out of the hall with a dark face and God King Fingyi and the others. They looked like they were about to storm in. Everyone's heart skipped a beat. They didn't dare to stay any longer. They hurriedly turned around and flew away in all directions. "All of you, stop." Divine King Fengyi frowned. He subconsciously raised his hand and shouted for the domain lords to stop. Unexpectedly, not only did the region lords not stop, they even sped up and vanished in the blink of an eye. Empyrean God King was furious at the sight of this. He stopped at the entrance of the main hall and stood under the eaves of the corridor. He pointed at the empty square and cursed furiously, "These damn bastards, how dare they slander me like this? Now they don't even listen to my orders. Are they trying to rebel?" The celestial king was furious. Divine King Fengyi could only shut his mouth and sigh helplessly in his heart. The governor of the Forbidden Army and the other divine generals also shrunk their necks and lowered their heads. They didn't dare to interrupt. Everyone was well aware that the situation was getting worse. Today's matter would soon spread throughout Tiandu and be known by tens of thousands of soldiers. It was no longer important what the truth was. No matter how the celestial king explained, the dozens of territorial lords and tens of thousands of soldiers would believe that he was trying to seize military power. After a long silence, the celestial king's anger gradually dissipated. He brought Divine King Fengyi, the governor of the Forbidden Army, and the other generals to the study room for a discussion. In the spacious and luxurious study room, the celestial king sat down and drank 3 cups of tea in one go. Only then did he calm down. Divine King Fengyi and the others stood in front of the study table. They were a little nervous as they pondered silently. After a moment of silence, the celestial king opened his mouth and said, "Today's matter can't be concealed or suppressed. Otherwise it will backfire and cause the soldiers to retaliate even more. That old bastard Qing Feng deliberately slandered me and spread rumors. Soon the soldiers will know. Do you have any way to eliminate the impact of this matter?" Divine King Fengyi thought for a moment and persuaded, "My lord, based on our understanding of the territorial lord of Qing Feng, he has always been this straightforward and stubborn. He might not be trying to slander you. He probably really was wronged and said those words out of anger. If we want to settle this matter, we have to start with him." The celestial king frowned. He suppressed his anger and asked, "What? Do I have to kill the 2 captains of the Forbidden Army to prove the territorial lord's innocence? In order to settle this matter, do I have to apologize to him and restore his reputation?" "Oh no. Divine King Fengyi quickly waved his hand and persuaded, "My lord, if you kill the 2 captains of the Forbidden Army, not only will you disappoint the Forbidden Army, you will also prove that you are biased towards the Forbidden Army and deliberately slandered the territorial lord. That will be even more difficult to explain." The governor of the Forbidden Army also nodded in agreement and said, "My lord, the Forbidden Army is your right-hand man. Their loyalty to you can be witnessed by the sun and moon. You must not disappoint the soldiers. Moreover, the territorial lord of Qing Feng and his henchmen have always been rebellious. You must not be soft-hearted." The celestial king frowned and asked, "Then according to the 2 of you, I will ignore the territorial lord of Qing Feng and immediately take over the military power of him and the other 5 territorial lords. Then I will beat them at their own game and take over the military power of the dozens of territorial lords and forces. Since I can control all the soldiers, I don't care what the other territorial lords think of me, right?" Divine King Fengyi was stunned. He shook his head with a wry smile and said, "My lord, I am afraid this is not a good idea. Those soldiers are most loyal to their territorial lords. Even if you forcibly take them in, I am afraid they will be dissatisfied and may even mutiny." "Bastard!" The celestial king was so angry that he slammed the table and scolded, "The entire firmament land is my territory. Everyone is my people. Those soldiers should listen to my orders. How dare they disobey my orders and go against me? If they dare to disobey me, I will make an example out of them and behead them in public. I don't believe that they are not afraid of death. The wry smile on Divine King Fengyi's face became more obvious. He waved his hand and said, "My lord, although you say so, we cannot take the risk now." "Then tell me, how should we solve this matter?" The Celestial King lost his patience and asked angrily. "My lord, please give us some time. This matter needs to be discussed at length." Divine King Fengyi could only persuade the Celestial King patiently. "Let's see how the soldiers react first. It is not too late to make a decision then." Chapter 43:21. When Ji Tianxing returned to the encampment, more than 2,000 soldiers under his command had already received the news. More than 20 commanders and many guards were waiting outside the palace to welcome him. Seeing his bleak and disheartened appearance, the commanders and guards were furious. They hated the Imperial Guard and Empyrean God King Sky Universe to the core. They were only loyal to the Lord of the Qingfeng region. They were the elite subordinates who had been promoted and cultivated by the Lord of the Qingfeng region. Now that the Lord of the Qingfeng region was humiliated in public and his reputation was damaged, they could not bear it. It was no exaggeration to say that even if Ji Tianxing announced that he would lead the soldiers to rebel against Heaven Capital, the soldiers would still follow. However, Ji Tianxing had not revealed any flaws in his acting. The development of the matter was also within his expectations. Of course, he would not be impatient. Only inciting more than 2,000 soldiers under his command was far from his expectations. Therefore, he said to the commanders and guards in a bleak tone, "Inform all the soldiers to gather in this square in a quarter of an hour. I have something important to announce." The more than 20 commanders and many guards had heard some news and guessed what the Lord was going to do. They hurriedly opened their mouths to dissuade him. "My lord, please reconsider. My lord, even if the Celestial King forces you, you can't give in. We all support you. You gave us our lives. It is all thanks to your cultivation that we are where we are today. No matter what, we will not leave you." Ji Tianxing did not say much. He directly closed his eyes and said in a low and solemn voice, "Are my orders no longer effective?" The commanders trembled and hurriedly bowed. After repeatedly saying yes, they turned and left to gather the soldiers. In less than a quarter of an hour, more than 2,000 soldiers gathered in the square and lined up in formation. They all looked at Ji Tianxing with complicated eyes. Ji Tianxing did not beat around the bush and said directly, "I believe that everyone has heard and is mentally prepared. That's right. Today this old man suffered an unjust injustice. In order to prove my innocence, I dared to reprimand the Celestial King in the Great Hall. I can die to prove my innocence. This old man has no way out. But I can't implicate all of you and make you the target of the Celestial King's punishment. From this moment on, this old man will hand over the command of the army and hand over all my soldiers to the Celestial King. From now on, you must obey the command of the Celestial King and fight for the firmament land. Do you understand?" Although more than 2,000 soldiers had heard of this matter, when they heard these words from the mouth of the Domain Lord, they couldn't help but discuss and shout in grief and indignation. "No. Domain Lord, no matter who it is, anyone who dares to slander your reputation is our enemy. Domain Lord, we have always obeyed your orders and never dared to disobey. But this time, please forgive us for daring to defy your orders. We will definitely not carry it out. We are the people of the Qingfeng domain and the soldiers of the Domain Lord. We will only be loyal to you until we die. This subordinate's life was saved by you. My abilities and position were also given to me by you. Without your help and nurturing, this subordinate would be a lonely ghost. So even if I die, I will never leave you. We are the people of the Qingfeng domain and we will die as ghosts of the Qingfeng domain. We will never obey anyone else's orders. Don't worry, Domain Lord. Even if we die, we will clear your name." Countless soldiers and commanders shouted at the top of their lungs, expressing their unwavering defiance of the order. Ji Tianxing tried to persuade him a few more times and explained all the reasons clearly. But the more he persuaded them, the more he didn't want to implicate the soldiers, the more resolute they became. At this moment, the unity and loyalty of more than 2,000 soldiers to the Domain Lord of the Qingfeng domain were vividly displayed. Some Imperial guards and Immortal King Fengyi's spies were hiding not far away. When they saw this scene, they quickly reported it to the Imperial Guard Governor and Immortal King Fingyi. Soon, Immortal King Fingyi, the Imperial Guard Governor and Celestial King all knew about it. Whether it was the reaction of the Territorial Lord of Light Breeze or the reaction of the 2,000 soldiers, it was all within their expectations. It was obvious that the Domain Lord was disheartened because his innocence was insulted. He had no intention of rebelling. Even if he had to give up his military power, he didn't complain or instigate the soldiers to rebel. He even persuaded them to obey the order. However, the loyalty of the 2,000 soldiers to the Territorial Lord of Cool Breeze was unquestionable. This made Immortal King Fingyi feel very troubled. He couldn't think of a solution. The Empyrean God King's expression was ugly. His fists cracked as he clenched them. His hatred for the Realm Lord deepened. Reasonably speaking, all the people in the Firmament continent were his people. They should respect and worship him more. However, the soldiers under the command of the Domain Lord only recognized the Domain Lord and dared to betray him for the Domain Lord. Wasn't it infuriating? Ji Tianxing persuaded the soldiers in every possible way, but they refused to abandon him and obey the Celestial King. He had no choice but to dismiss the soldiers. He went back to his study to rest. Of course, he didn't want to rest. He wanted to wait for news from other domains. At the same time, the 5 domain lords who were punished with him and were forced to hand over the Tiger Talisman were doing the same thing. They all gathered their soldiers and said that they would give up their military power and hand over the soldiers to the Celestial King. The result was easy to imagine. The soldiers were united against a common enemy and expressed their indignation towards Empyrean God King and the Imperial Guard. At the same time, the soldiers refused to leave. They would follow their domain lord even if they had to betray Heaven Capital. The 5 domain lords had no choice but to let the soldiers rest. Later, the 5 of them agreed to visit the domain lord of the Qingfeng domain to see what plans he had. On the other hand, the news that the domain lord of the Qingfeng domain was stopped from visiting his friends and was humiliated by the 2 captains of the Imperial Guards spread throughout Heaven Capital. The cause, process, and result of the incident were known by dozens of domain lords, experts, and tens of thousands of soldiers. For a time, everyone was talking about this matter and it was spreading like wildfire. Originally, it had nothing to do with the other domain lords. At most, people sympathized with the domain lord of the Qingfeng domain. But in the end, the truth was revealed. It turned out that the Celestial King directed and acted out the drama in order to seize the military power of all the domain lords. It was closely related to the dozens of domain lords and tens of thousands of soldiers. The soldiers' reactions were almost the same. Since the Celestial King was so protective of the Imperial Guards and didn't take their lives seriously, why should they be loyal and obey his orders? Even if they were labeled as rebels and traitors, they would never obey the command of the Celestial King. They would still be loyal to their domain lord. After all, they were the confidants of the domain lords. The domain lords would cherish and protect them. If they followed the command of the Celestial King, they would only be cannon fodder. Chapter 43:22. As the tens of thousands of soldiers discussed this matter, the matter became even more exaggerated and outrageous. The actions of the 2 captains were described as even more arrogant, despicable, and despicable. The Celestial King's favoritism and conspiracy were described as even more sinister and despicable. As a result, the soldiers' rebellious mood grew. In addition, there were many domain lords who were unwilling to hand over their military power, either openly or in secret, deliberately instigating the soldiers under their command. Since they were unwilling to give up their soldiers, the soldiers had no reason to obey the Celestial King's orders. Moreover, as the matter fermented, the soldiers' hatred for the Imperial Guards and the Celestial King continued to rise. There were no conflicts between the 2 sides for the time being, but the antagonism between them grew to the point where they could not coexist. One day later, God King Fingyi, God King Empyrean, and the Imperial Army Supervisor gathered a lot of information and confirmed that 99% of the soldiers were unwilling to listen to their orders. They were all rebellious and had a rebellious attitude. Therefore, Fengyi was responsible for spreading the news and explaining to the soldiers that the Celestial King had no intention of taking back his military power. As for the Celestial King's plot to frame the Cool Breeze territorial master, it was all a misunderstanding. On the other side, Fengyi personally found Ji Tianxing and negotiated with him in a secret room. God King Fengyi expressed that we can clear your name and punish those 2 captains severely. If you have no intention of rebelling and did not deliberately defame and slander the Celestial King, you have to stand up and speak up to clear the Celestial King's name. In addition, in order to convince the other territorial masters and the soldiers, you have to voluntarily accept the punishment and apologize to the Celestial King. No one else was present when the two of them were negotiating, so no one knew what they were talking about. However, the commanders and soldiers under the Cool Breeze Territorial Master saw the Cool Breeze Territorial Master angrily scold Feng Yi and chase him out of the encampment. At that time the Cool Breeze Territorial Master roared loudly, "I would rather die than submit. I would never lie against my conscience and would never harm my colleagues." God King Feng Yi also had a face of helplessness as he angrily flung his sleeves and left. Before he left, he even warned the Domain Lord of the Clear Wind Domain not to regret his decision. Since the Domain Lord was so stubborn, he would not have a good ending. Therefore, the commanders and soldiers began to imagine the scene of their negotiation. Most likely, it was God King Feng Yi who represented the Celestial King and reprimanded the Lord of Light Wind, asking him to lie and help them. This completely infuriated the soldiers under the command of the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord. They all declared that even if they had to fight with the Imperial Guards, they would protect the region leader and would never bow to evil. At the same time, the news quickly spread and many territorial lords and soldiers found out about it. Many domain lords had expected that God King Feng Yi would negotiate with the Clear Wind Domain Lord and force him to change his words. The territorial lord of Qingfeng was full of righteousness. He would rather die than submit, which was within everyone's expectations. Therefore no one doubted those rumors. They all believed them without a doubt. The dozens of domain masters and tens of thousands of soldiers felt the pressure increase and worry. They knew very well that the Celestial King was going to punish the territorial lord of Qingfeng. This was to make an example out of him. After dealing with the tough territorial lord of Qingfeng, he would deal with them one by one. Many domain lords were anxious. They gathered in groups of 3 to 5 and rushed to visit the territorial lord of Qingfeng. First, they wanted to sound him out. Second, they wanted to know what the territorial lord of Qingfeng was going to do. As for the third, all the domain lords, no matter what faction they belonged to, now wanted to band together. A single domain lord or faction could only be casually punished by the Celestial King. They could not resist. Even a powerful senior like the territorial lord of Qingfeng was in a terrible fix and could only die to show his sincerity. Therefore, the other domain lords did not dare to take any chances. They could only try their best to unite. In the dead of night, in the encampment of the Clear Wind Domain, Ji Tianxing lived in the Divine Palace. The double defense array was activated, protecting the entire Divine Palace and preventing the outside world from investigating the situation inside. In the spacious and bright main hall, Ji Tianxing sat at the head of the table. His face was gloomy and his expression was bleak and lonely. More than 60 domain lords and more than a dozen leaders of factions and clans sat in several rows in the main hall. They looked like a group of desperate rebels who had gathered together to discuss whether or not to rebel. Although things had not reached the stage of rebellion yet. However, based on their current situation and mood, they were not far from betrayal. As for their loyalty to the Celestial King, it had disappeared and no longer existed. Senior Qingfeng, we are all aware of what happened to you. We deeply sympathize with you and are indignant. Although we have nothing to do with this, we are on the same side and in the same situation. Tonight we are all gathered here. Behind closed doors we are going to speak our minds freely and discuss countermeasures. A high divine king realm domain lord stood up and spoke, revealing everyone's thoughts and intentions. Another domain lord also stood up and said, "The Celestial King wants to punish the chicken to warn the monkey." Senior Qingfeng is a person of virtue and prestige. He is highly respected among us domain lords. If the domain lord of Clear Wind falls, who else can resist? Therefore, the domain lord of Clear Wind is our bottom line. For our own safety and situation, we can't let the domain lord of Clear Wind fall. I have a suggestion. Let's swear an alliance tonight and advance and retreat together. Only when we are bound together and live and die together can we be qualified to negotiate with the Celestial King and get the rights we deserve. This person's suggestion immediately received the approval and support of many domain lords. Another domain lord stood up and said with righteous indignation, "How loyal are we to the Celestial King and His Majesty the God Emperor? Back then, Empyrean God King gave the order and we abandoned our territory and cave abodes. bringing only our most trusted and elite soldiers to Firmament Capital. Now the Celestial King is treating us like this. It's really disappointing. We can be loyal to His Majesty the God Emperor, and we can also fight bloody battles and risk our lives to protect Heaven Capital. However, we can't be used as pawns and cannon fodder by the Celestial King. We can't be at his mercy and be killed and sacrificed at will. Ji Tianxing waited until all the domain lords had given their impassioned speeches, and everyone's emotions were stirred up. Only then did Ji Tianxing speak. I can understand your feelings and support your suggestion. We can form an alliance and advance and retreat together. However, have you thought about the purpose of our alliance? To protect ourselves? How can we protect ourselves? Also, the Celestial King has been defeated by the Kenshin's attacks and has almost no strength to fight back. How long can we hold on? Can we win? When the Kenshin attacks Heaven Capital, our soldiers will fight bloody battles until all of them die. What if the Celestial King and his Imperial Guards see that the situation is not good and surrender to the Kenshin? Everyone should look further and not be constrained by the present. Think about the battle between the Celestial King and the Kenshin. Chapter 43-23. Dozens of territorial lords and tens of thousands of soldiers were at loggerheads with the Celestial King and the Imperial Guards. This was all part of Ji Tianxing's meticulous plan. Now that the two sides were at loggerheads, it was almost impossible for them to reconcile. When many of the territorial lords proposed an alliance, he took the opportunity to lead the topic to the battle between the Celestial King and the Kenshin. The dozens of territorial lords were stunned for a moment, then immediately understood. Their expressions and eyes changed subtly. Everyone was silent as they weighed this matter in their hearts. Even though everyone had their own thoughts, no one dared to speak up. After all, no one wanted to be labeled as a traitor. Seeing this, Ji Tianxing smiled and said, "The double defense array has been activated. No one can eavesdrop on our conversation. Don't you want to speak freely? Of course, I'm just reminding everyone to think long-term. Please don't misunderstand. I can guarantee with my reputation that I will never side with the Kenshin, and I will not let anyone be a traitor." Hearing this, many of the territorial lords heaved a sigh of relief. Earlier, they were still worried that if everyone suggested to side with the Kenshin, what would they do? If they did not side with the Kenshin, they would be separated from their colleagues. They would not be able to get anything out of the Celestial King either. If they sided with the Kenshin, they would become traitors that everyone reviled. Fortunately, Territorial Lord Qingfeng used his reputation and life to guarantee that he would never side with the Kenshin. Many of the territorial lords thought that as long as they did not become traitors and side with the Kenshin, everything would be fine. Some of the more quick-witted territorial lords immediately found the key point after Ji Tianxing's reminder. They spoke up one after another, enlightening everyone. That's right. We are the same as Territorial Lord Qingfeng. We will never side with the Kenshin and we will never be traitors. But we will never be cannon fodder for the Celestial King. When to fight and under what circumstances we can shed blood and sacrifice, that will be decided by us. That's right. We must control our own destiny and not be manipulated by the Celestial King. We don't have to rely on the Kenshin, but we don't have to obey the orders of the Celestial King and fight the Kenshin to the death. Yes. We have to make our own decisions and decide whether or not to participate in the war depending on the situation. Once these domain lords explained the situation, everyone present understood what was going on. Of course, they could choose not to join the Kenshin. However, when the Kenshin attacked Tiandu, they could also stand by and let the Celestial King and the Imperial Guards attack first. In short, they were not going to be scapegoats or cannon fodder. They had to let the Imperial Guards take the lead. Once the Imperial Guards were destroyed by the Kenshin, they would look at the situation and decide whether or not to join the battle. Understanding this point, the dozens of domain masters felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders, and they no longer felt any pressure in their hearts. Ji Tianxing's plot succeeded again. He secretly sneered. But on the surface he did not reveal any flaws and continued to guide everyone. Since everyone has reached a consensus on this most important matter, we can form an alliance tonight. But please remember, we are forming an alliance to protect ourselves, to control our own destiny, to not be manipulated and trampled on, and not for anything else. Many of the domain lords showed a tacit smile and nodded their heads in agreement. Ji Tianxing continued, "Now that the long-term concerns have been resolved, let's talk about the immediate concerns. After we form an alliance tonight, the Celestial King will soon receive the news. He will not sit by and do nothing. Before the Kenshin attack Tiandu, he will use the method of breaking us down one by one and dividing us and try to subdue us. Perhaps he will use coercion and bribery, or perhaps he will forcefully capture us, or use vicious methods to coerce us. In short, with the nature of the Celestial King, he will definitely deal with us at all costs and only want to stabilize his power. And the first person he will deal with will definitely be me. My relationship with him is already like fire and water. Even if I die, I will never surrender and will only use my death to show my sincerity. I hope everyone can remain clear-headed, remember the oath of the alliance, and do not be afraid of death. If you watch coldly from the sidelines and are timid, then you will be next. Such a simple principle I believe everyone understands, so there is no need for me to say more, right? Dozens of domain lords hurriedly nodded their heads to show that they understood. They all vowed that as long as they formed an alliance, they would not go back on their words and would definitely advance and retreat together. Ji Tianxing was just going through the motions. In fact, he did not have much hope for the trust of the domain lords. Even if there were some domain lords who would go back on their words, he would not find it strange. After all, what everyone recited was just an ordinary oath, unlike Ji Tianxing's heavenly oath, which had absolute deterrence. However, Ji Tianxing was not worried about this problem, because he still had more tricks up his sleeve, which would continue to intensify the conflict between the two sides until Tiandu was completely chaotic. Next, dozens of domain lords discussed some details, and began to swear the alliance. In the past, Domain Lord Qingfeng was highly respected, and was respected by many domain lords, but could not be called a leader. Among the dozens of domain lords, there were at least 4 or 5 domain lords who were on par with him in terms of status and reputation. But after this incident, the pride and integrity he displayed won the respect of all the domain lords, and unknowingly became a leader. More than 60 domain lords and more than a dozen leaders of forces swore the alliance in public, and he also became the uncrowned king, the leader of everyone. Half a quarter of an hour later, the many experts finished their oaths, and the alliance was successfully formed. Ji Tianxing, as the host and leader of the alliance, said to everyone, "If we were outside Tiandu after we formed an alliance, we should have a banquet to celebrate. But now that we are in Tiandu and the situation is complicated, we can avoid this. If we are still alive in the future, we must make up for this banquet. Alright, everyone, go back and make preparations. Inform the soldiers." The domain lords and experts all nodded with a smile, bowed and took their leave. Just as Ji Tianxing said. More than 60 domain lords and more than a dozen leaders of forces formed an alliance, and in just half an hour the Celestial King received the news. He was unable to restrain his anger, and summoned Divine King Feng Yi, the governor of the Forbidden Army, and several divine generals overnight. "Bastard! This group of traitorous ingrates, all the power and status they have was given by me. Now they have formed an alliance and joined forces to rebel against me to become my enemy. This is intolerable. They have already crossed my bottom line. Tonight, no matter what, I will make them pay the price in blood." Divine King Feng Yi saw that he was so angry and had a bad premonition and quickly asked, "My lord, what do you want to do?" Celestial King gritted his teeth and said, "Isn't Domain Lord Qingfeng the leader of their alliance? Those domain lords were all instigated by him. I order you to bring 1,000 Forbidden Army and immediately capture that old man. I will behead him in public as a warning to others." Chapter 43-24. "My lord, you can't do that." God King Fengyi panicked and tried to dissuade Celestial King. "The dozens of territorial lords have gathered together. If you kill territorial Lord Qingfeng now, not only will it not serve as a deterrent, it will also push the other territorial lords to the opposite side. Furthermore, territorial Lord Qingfeng is so stubborn that he is not afraid of death. If you kill him, I'm afraid he will be more than happy. You can help him achieve his heroic reputation." Celestial King was even angrier. His eyes were red as he roared, "What? They are all my subjects. Could it be that I can only watch them rebel without punishing them? Do I still have to consider their feelings? Preposterous. The entire firmament mainland is my territory. I can kill whoever I want." God King Fengyi was completely speechless. Celestial King was right. No one could refute him. However, these words were too ear-piercing. Even God King Fengyi and the imperial military governor felt uncomfortable when they heard it. Celestial King was in a rage and did not notice this. Seeing that God King Fengyi was speechless, he roared, "What are you waiting for? Why aren't you going to catch him?" God King Fengyi wanted to persuade him again, but the Imperial Army governor had already led 2 divine generals to gather 1,000 Imperial Army soldiers to carry out the mission. God King Fengyi was worried that the Imperial Army governor would not do things properly. He quickly bid farewell to Celestial King and chased after them. 15 minutes later, God King Fengyi and the Imperial Army governor led 1,000 silver-armored Imperial Army soldiers to the encampment of the Qingfeng territory. More than 2,000 soldiers had already expected this after Ji Tianxing's warning. Therefore, when the Imperial Army soldiers arrived, more than 2,000 soldiers surrounded the palace and the courtyard. They were wearing armor and holding swords and confronting the Imperial Army soldiers. Even without God King Fengyi's explanation, the soldiers already knew what they were going to do. Therefore everyone was furious. Their eyes were filled with anger and killing intent. God King Fengyi felt a headache coming on when he saw this. They could not possibly start a fight, right? Then things would get out of hand. However, the Imperial Army soldiers had always been arrogant. They did not care about these local troops at all. The Imperial Army governor was also full of energy. He ordered sternly, "You bastards, how dare you point your weapons at me and the Imperial Army soldiers? We are here to capture the territorial Lord Qingfeng for trial. Why don't you all retreat?" Hearing his domineering tone, God King Fengyi's eyes turned black and he almost fell over. He glared at the Imperial Army governor and could not help but curse. "Are you AF asterisk 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 asterisk? You could have just said that you wanted the Clearwind Domain Lord to meet with Empyrean God King. Why did you have to say that you were here to capture him? Are you clearly want to provoke the Imperial Army soldiers?" V. When the 2,000 soldiers heard that the Imperial Guards had come to capture the Clearwind Domain Lord, they knew that Empyrean God King wanted to make an example out of the Clearwind Domain Lord. All of a sudden, everyone was filled with grief and indignation. They gripped their weapons tightly and let out angry roars. "You want to kill the Domain Lord? Then you'll have to step over our dead bodies. As long as we are still alive, don't even think about killing Territorial Lord. Brothers, the time of life and death has come. Tonight, let us use practical actions to repay the Region Lord's kindness in nurturing us." The 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers shouted at the same time. They looked like they were ready to die. It was quite tragic. The Imperial Army governor frowned and shouted angrily, "A bunch of reckless idiots. Do you want to rebel? Don't forget that this is Heaven Capital. If you seek death, you will not be spared." The Imperial Army soldiers ignored him. They did not talk nonsense with him. Instead, they responded to him with practical actions. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. There was no need for the 20-something commanders to give orders. Over 2,000 warriors cast their spells simultaneously, wielding their weapons and releasing all kinds of secret magic that could cover the sky and cover the earth. The sky was filled with the light and shadows of divine spells, wind, fire, and lightning. With the power to destroy heaven and earth, they rained down on the 1,000 Imperial Guards. While the Imperial Army soldiers attacked with all their might, they did not forget to shout, "Get lost, and die." The Imperial Army governor was furious. The 1,000 Imperial Army soldiers were also furious. They did not hesitate to block and counterattack. Just like that, the two sides started fighting outside the palace. They used all their divine powers and mystic arts. Divine King Fengyi was completely helpless. Now that things had developed to this point, it was not something he could control or stop. Even if he repeatedly ordered the Imperial Army soldiers to stop attacking. But if the Imperial Army governor did not give the order, the Imperial Army soldiers would not listen to him. Moreover, even if some of the Imperial Army soldiers stopped, the Imperial Army soldiers would not stop attacking. Instead, they took the opportunity to kill a group of Imperial Army soldiers. As a result, the Imperial Army soldiers were even more furious. It was even more impossible for them to stop. The scene was completely chaotic. Only the divine light covered a radius of 10,000 miles. Shouts shook the sky. Such a huge commotion immediately alarmed the people within a radius of 10,000 miles. More than 20 territorial lords brought their soldiers and rushed over to see what was going on. After fighting for a short while, the Imperial Guards suffered more than 300 casualties and were forced to retreat. Although the Imperial Guards were all elites, The other party outnumbered them by more than twice. Of course, they would be at a disadvantage. Thus, in a fit of rage, the Imperial Army governor sent out a message to gather another 3,000 Imperial Army soldiers to assist. A quarter of an hour later, more than half of the 1,000 Imperial guards were either dead or injured. Only about 400 of them were still fighting. The territorial lord of Lightwind had also lost more than 700 men. At this moment, the 3,000 Imperial guards rushed over to help. Over 20 domain lords led over 10,000 soldiers and rushed to the battlefield. The 3,000 Imperial guards were about to enter the battle to rescue their comrades and kill the soldiers of the Cool Breeze domain. More than 20 domain lords hesitated for a moment before they also commanded their soldiers to protect the soldiers of the Cool Breeze domain. It seemed that a great battle was about to break out. At this critical moment, the Celestial King finally arrived, appearing majestically in the night sky. All of you stop. The Celestial King looked down at the battlefield from above. With a furious roar, the Imperial guards all stopped and retreated tens of thousands of feet. He then turned to look at the 20-plus domain lords and over 10,000 warriors. With an ashen face, he shouted angrily, "Stop! Are you trying to rebel?" Although many of the domain lords and soldiers wanted to resist, the Celestial King's power still lingered. Everyone stopped casting spells and attacking. At this moment, Ji Tianxing finally appeared and flew out of the palace. "Everyone put away your weapons. Don't be rude to the Celestial King." Ji Tianxing's clothes were neat and tidy, and his long white hair was meticulously combed. He walked into the battlefield at a moderate pace. Over 20 domain lords and 10,000 soldiers silently put away their weapons. Their eyes were focused on him and the Celestial King. Everyone knew that the Celestial King and the Territorial Lord of Lightwind were in a standoff. One of them had to die tonight to calm the chaos. Chapter 43:25. Since the Celestial King and the Territorial Governor were like fire and water, one of them had to die tonight. There was a big gap between their strength. One was a 7th stage Upper Divine King while the other was a Peak Divine King. Everyone was sure that the Territorial Governor would die under the Celestial King's sword. There was no doubt about it. However, many people knew that the Territorial Governor was not afraid of death. He had the idea of dying to prove his innocence. Compared to his life, he cared more about his reputation. Everyone could not help but think that the Territorial Governor might take this opportunity to settle the score with the Celestial King tonight. If he could prove his innocence with his death, he would be willing to do so. "Territorial Governor, do you admit your crime?" The Celestial King glared at Ji Tianxing and asked in a low voice. Ji Tianxing replied expressionlessly, "If you want to condemn someone, you can always find a pretext." "Humph! Don't quibble." The Celestial King scolded. "Although you won't admit your crime, you are guilty after all. You know very well that more than 2,000 soldiers under your command have been used by you. Dozens of territorial governors and tens of thousands of soldiers have also been instigated by you. You know that you have committed a heinous crime and will definitely die, so you are guilty." Ji Tianxing looked at him indifferently and said, "Celestial King, since Kenshin came to Firmament Land, we have witnessed what you have done. We are well aware of your so-called talents, your shrewdness, your stratagems, and your natural disposition. Dozens of territorial governors and tens of thousands of soldiers have their own scales in their hearts. How can they be instigated by others? I asked the soldiers to stop fighting not because I am guilty or afraid, but because I don't want my men to die for no reason. This is the result of your incompetence. How can you let your loyal soldiers bear the consequences?" In everyone's opinion, the territorial governor had made up his mind to completely break off his relationship with the Celestial King. He knew that he wouldn't be able to survive the night, so he didn't try to hide it any longer and spoke his mind. As a result, the Celestial King's face turned red and his whole body trembled in anger. Although many people felt that he was incompetent, he was still an overlord. Due to his power and prestige, no one dared to say anything. The territorial lord of Qingfeng was about to die, so he had no qualms about exposing the Celestial King in public. The Celestial King was furious. He pointed at Ji Tianxing and cursed, "Lord of Qingfeng, you are evil. Don't try to mislead people and slander me again. I gave you a chance to turn over a new leaf, but you didn't cherish it. Since that's the case, I'll behead you tonight according to the law as a warning to others." After saying that, the Celestial King's entire body burst forth with a murderous aura, igniting a blood-red flame. He had actually brought out the Heavenly Slayer Divine Saber, intending to personally kill the Domain Lord of Lightwind. Ji Tianxing had originally planned to sacrifice himself for a righteous cause in front of everyone tonight. In this way, the Celestial King's incompetence would be confirmed, and there would be no possibility of reconciliation between him and the alliance of Domain Lords. At the same time, Ji Tianxing could go into hiding and continue the next step of his plan after using his identity as the Domain Lord of Lightwind. Next, he planned to impersonate the Domain Lords, Deputy Domain Lords, Commanders, and so on to incite conflict between the alliance of Domain Lords and the Imperial Guards, creating chaos and killing. When the two sides had completely broken off and were fighting each other, he would take the opportunity to eliminate the Imperial Guards. He would release the Fantasy Sun sect and the other three forces to lead a surprise attack and occupy Heaven Capital as quickly as possible. The disciples of Shifeng Pavilion who had been waiting outside Heaven Capital would also follow his orders and cooperate with him from the inside. No matter how he looked at it, Ji Tianxing was not far from success. But at this moment, seeing the Celestial King bring out the Heavenly Slayer Divine Saber, intending to personally kill the Domain Lord, Ji Tianxing's mind flashed and he instantly changed his mind. He suddenly had a bolder and riskier idea. Seeing that the Celestial King was about to kill the Domain Lord of Lightwind, more than 1,000 soldiers of the Domain Lord of Lightwind drew their swords without hesitation and assumed a fighting stance. Although no one spoke, no one shouted any slogans. But the resolute eyes and expressions of the soldiers made their stance clear. In order to protect the Domain Lord, they would rather fight the Celestial King. The more than 20 Domain Lords quickly reached a consensus after a brief exchange of sound transmissions and discussions. They did not forget what Ji Tianxing had said before. The more dangerous the situation was, the more they had to fearlessly step forward. If they did not step forward tonight, no one would stand up for them when the Celestial King dealt with them in the future. Therefore, the more than 20 Domain Lords also made their stance clear. They would rather fight the Celestial King to protect the Domain Lord of Lightwind. When the thousands of Imperial Guards saw that the other party had drawn their swords and assumed a fighting stance, they did not dare to be negligent. One by one, they gripped their swords and sabers tightly and accumulated their divine power. The situation became tense again and a great battle was about to break out. Seeing this, the Celestial King was so angry that his eyes turned blood red. He repeatedly cursed the group of traitors. But the many Domain Lords and soldiers turned a deaf ear to him, and there was no trace of guilt on their faces. The Celestial King's gaze swept across the crowd, and finally returned to Ji Tianxing. He pointed at him and scolded angrily, "Good. Very good. To think that His Majesty the God Emperor trusted you so much, and that I have respected your character and conduct for the past 1,000 years. I did not expect that at this crucial moment, it would be you, an old man, who would incite everyone to oppose me." In fact, after Feng Yi's reminder, the Celestial King had already realized that something was wrong. No matter how upright and plain-spoken the Domain Lord of Lightwind was and how much he cared about his reputation, he would not have added fuel to the fire. Therefore, he had absolute reason to suspect that the Domain Lord of Lightwind had ulterior motives. But so what? Would the dozens of Domain Lords and tens of thousands of soldiers in the Domain Lords Alliance still believe him? The Celestial King felt deeply helpless. Ji Tianxing was still not angry. He looked at him calmly and said, "This is the will of the people and the will of the people. You are too headstrong and self-opinionated. You are never willing to face yourself and admit your mistakes. However, this is not important anymore. The soldiers will not forgive you." The Celestial King knew that he was right. But in his heart he thought that as long as he could get through this crisis, he would definitely wipe out everyone present tonight. At this time, Ji Tianxing continued, "Celestial King, from the beginning to the end, I was just dissatisfied with you and wanted to prove my innocence. Things have developed to this point and I did not want them to. I do not want to implicate tens of thousands of soldiers and dozens of Domain Lords. If you insist on beheading me in public, then it will only be a lose-lose situation. How about this? You and I leave this place and go to a remote place alone to settle our grudges. In this way we will not implicate the innocent soldiers, you can get what you want and I can die in a dignified manner. What do you think?" Chapter 43-26. Ji Tianxing's proposal made the Celestial King, Feng Yi, and the others very tempted. This was because both sides were ready for a showdown and were about to fight a great battle. This was the only way to reconcile. It could solve the conflict between the Celestial King and the Lord of the Clear Wind region without causing internal strife among the tens of thousands of soldiers. This was exactly what the Celestial King wanted. What reason did he have to refuse? The dozens of domain lords and tens of thousands of soldiers of the Domain Lords Alliance were relieved and accepted the proposal without hesitation. After all, they were in a dilemma. They did not want to violate the agreement of the Domain Lords Alliance and watch the Lord of the Clear Wind region be killed, but they also did not want to fight the Celestial King and be executed as a traitor. The proposal put forward by the Lord of the Clear Wind region would not implicate the tens of thousands of people of the Domain Lords Alliance, nor would they be branded as traitors. It was killing two birds with one stone. In this way, the Celestial King readily agreed to Ji Tianxing's proposal, and the Domain Lords Alliance also expressed their tacit approval. However, the location of the duel between the Celestial King and Ji Tianxing needed to be explained in advance. Lord of the Clear Wind region, you still have some conscience. I agree to your proposal. Tell me, where do you want to be buried? The Celestial King looked askance at Ji Tianxing and asked proudly. Ji Tianxing looked up at the sky, his expression full of loneliness and disappointment. He said in a low voice, "The thing I regret most in my life is that I came to Heaven Capital with all my loyal and trusted elites. I thought I was serving my master loyally, but I did not expect that I would end up with my reputation ruined and my body destroyed. Haha. I am about to die and I have one last request. That is, let me leave Heaven Capital and die in the starry sky where no one cares about me. I do not want this dirty and filthy place to be my final resting place. Presumably, the Celestial King also does not want a traitor like me to desecrate your sacred cave residence, right?" His sneer was filled with mockery, causing the tens of thousands of soldiers to feel indescribably sorrowful. The Celestial King was quite angry, but he also knew that this was the stubbornness of the territorial lord of Qingfeng. If he did not agree, there would be more twists and turns. Therefore, he was about to nod and agree to fight with the realm lord of Light Wind in the extraterritorial starry sky. However, Celestial King Fengyi sensed that something was amiss. He frowned and hurriedly warned the Celestial King, "My lord, be careful." Celestial King frowned and thought for a moment. Then he waved his hand disapprovingly and said, "Old Qingfeng doesn't seem to be plotting anything. Moreover, all the helpers he could find were here. As long as he's alone, no matter where the duel takes place, I can easily take care of him." God King Fengyi hesitated for a moment before replying via voice transmission. "Although that is indeed the case, I am still worried. Furthermore, I feel that there is something strange about the Clear Wind Domain Lord." Celestial King thought for a moment and understood what he meant. He asked with a sneer, "You mean you are worried that old Qingfeng is colluding with the Kenshin? He purposely lured me out of Heaven Capital?" "I don't rule out this possibility." God King Fengyi smiled embarrassedly but did not deny it. Celestial King nodded and said, "Yes, your concern is reasonable. It is not that we are timid, but there are some things that need to be considered thoroughly. However, with old Qingfeng's character, he would not do such a despicable thing. Otherwise, he would have to bear the infamy of a traitor after his death. That would be the most unacceptable thing for him. Furthermore, I will keep an eye on him and will not give him a chance to contact the Kenshin. Also, even if we enter the extraterritorial void, I will decide where the duel will take place. I will not let him lead the way to the place he has set." Both of them knew that they had no choice but to agree to the territorial lord's proposal. They had to go to the extraterritorial void. If Celestial King refused to go, he would be mocked for being a coward. It would be a big deal if he could not suppress the territorial lord alliance and the two sides fought. Since Celestial King was on guard and had considered everything thoroughly, God King Fengyi did not say anything more and nodded to show that there was no problem. Then Celestial King asked God King Fengyi to stay and preside over the situation. The governor of the Imperial Army also ordered all the Imperial Army to put away their weapons, get into formation and wait patiently for orders and results. Ji Tianxing also gave the order for more than 20 region masters and over 10,000 soldiers to put away their weapons and wait where they were. Many territorial lords and soldiers obeyed in silence. However, the more than 2,000 soldiers of the Light Wind territory were extremely reluctant to let their territorial lords die. These soldiers were like children who were about to lose their mother. They were so sad and helpless. However, some things had to be done. Some pain had to be experienced and endured. Ji Tianxing summoned the deputy territorial lord and two elders. He entrusted the more than 2,000 soldiers to them and left a few last words before he turned and left. Celestial King fulfilled his promise and flew into the sky alone. He broke through the space barrier and entered the extraterritorial void. Everyone looked up at the sky and watched Ji Tianxing and the Celestial King cross the space crack and disappear into the darkness. Both sides obeyed the order and stayed where they were. However, the news quickly spread throughout the entire Heaven capital and tens of thousands of soldiers learned about it. In just a short 15 minutes, everyone knew that Celestial King and the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng were going to duel. They would settle their grudges in the extraterritorial void. Celestial King would get rid of the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng as he wished, and the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng would use his death to show his sincerity. After tonight, the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng would no longer exist in the world. However, his reputation would be preserved. However, without the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng, how would the Territorial Lord's alliance get along with the Celestial King? Or rather, how would the Celestial King treat the Territorial Lord's alliance after killing the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng? This was the question that tens of thousands of soldiers were most concerned about. The Celestial King followed Ji Tianxing into the extraterritorial void and kept an eye on Ji Tianxing. He would never give him a chance to send a message. In fact, Ji Tianxing had been flying calmly and had no intention of sending a message. The two flew for millions of miles in the void. The Celestial King caught up with them and said coldly, "Territorial Lord of Qingfeng, I will lead the way. Just follow me." Obviously, he wanted to choose which area to duel so as not to fall into his opponent's trap. Ji Tianxing naturally did not refute. He said calmly, "As you wish." The Celestial King frowned and thought to himself, "Doesn't this old man have a plot? Where is he going to lead me to?" He was a little worried and continued to probe. "Well, the extraterritorial void is vast and boundless anyway. It's the same no matter where you go. In my opinion, there's no need to hurry on. You can rest here." Chapter 43-27. Ji Tianxing looked at the void around him and stopped to look at the Celestial King. There was an inexplicable look in his eyes. "Are you sure this is the right place?" The Celestial King was stunned. He thought that the Territorial Lord had changed his mind. If the Territorial Lord insisted on going somewhere, it meant that he was up to something. Therefore, the Celestial King sneered and said, "This is the place." "What? Are you not satisfied with the place I chose for you?" Ji Tianxing's lips curled into a playful smile as he nodded and said, "As long as you're satisfied." On the surface, there seemed to be nothing wrong with their conversation. But for some reason Empyrean God King felt that something was off. It was as if he was not choosing a place for the Territorial Lord, but the Territorial Lord was choosing for him. It was a ridiculous feeling. His heart skipped a beat. Then he took a closer look at the Territorial Lord of Light Wind and examined him from the inside out. No matter how he looked at it, there was nothing wrong with the Territorial Lord. What was the problem? The Celestial King was lost in thought. He was very vigilant against the Territorial Lord. His reason told him that no matter what tricks the Territorial Lord of Qingfeng used, he would not be able to defeat him. However, he felt more and more uneasy. If it were anyone else, their first reaction would be to retreat as soon as they realized that the situation was bad. However, the Celestial King was a peak Immortal King and the overlord of the firmament continent. How could he run away when facing the Territorial Lord alone? Not to mention that he had absolute confidence in killing the Realm Lord of Clear Wind, he would also lose face. Therefore, his first reaction was to end the battle as soon as possible. Swoosh! The Celestial King took out his heavenly slayer and pointed it at Ji Tianxing. He shouted coldly, "Old Qingfeng, don't play tricks in front of me. Today is the day you die. This will be your burial place. Cut the crap and prepare to die." After shouting, the Celestial King waved his heavenly slayer and unleashed all his power. He slashed out a divine light blade that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Instantly, the void within a radius of 10,000 miles was illuminated by the divine light. Ji Tianxing's surroundings were sealed and locked down by the Celestial King's consciousness. He had to bear the invisible pressure of the spirit. If he was really the Territorial Lord of Light Wind, he would be trembling with fear even though he was only at the 7th level of the Divine King realm. However, he was not the Lord of the Cool Breeze region. The pressure of the Celestial King had no effect on him. Furthermore, looking at the Celestial King going all out, he even felt like laughing. When he first arrived at the Firmament Land, he had wanted to assassinate the Celestial King. As long as the Celestial King was taken care of, the commanders, heavenly generals and domain masters would be leaderless. Their fighting power would be greatly reduced, and the Rebel Alliance would have a much easier time conquering the entire continent. However, the Celestial King remained in Celestial Capital, guarded by many God King experts. No matter how strong Ji Tianqing was, he could not kill the Celestial King, who was at the peak of the Divine King realm, under the protection of hundreds of experts. That was why he spent so much time and gradually devised so many schemes to sneak into Celestial Capital. Even after entering Celestial Capital, he had no chance to assassinate the Celestial King. Therefore, he tried to stir up the conflict between the Domain Master, the Imperial Guards, and the Celestial King. Originally, he planned to use the Domain Master Alliance to plunge Celestial Capital into chaos. Then he would lead the thousands of people from the four forces to seize the opportunity to occupy Celestial Capital. However, as the situation developed, the Celestial King was completely enraged and planned to do it himself. Therefore, Ji Tianqing had an idea and used the opportunity to lure the Celestial King out of Celestial Capital. Under the circumstances at that time, the Celestial King had no choice but to follow him to the extraterritorial void. And now it was time to reap the rewards. After scheming for so long, I finally forced you into a dead end and you had to walk right into my trap. Celestial King, this is the first time you see me, but it will also be the last time. Ji Tianqing said these two sentences with a smile. With a flip of his right hand, he took out the sword of Burial of Heaven and swung it to meet the attack. Swish, swish, swish. He did not use any unique skill but just casually sprinkled sword light all over the sky. The dazzling golden sword light and the five-colored saber light collided, creating an earth-shattering sound in the void and exploding five-colored dazzling fragments of divine light. Bang, bang, bang. In the blink of an eye, the saber light all over the sky was defeated and turned into fragments of divine light that scattered in the void. The Celestial King was dumbfounded and stared at Ji Tianqing with his mouth agape. This is impossible. He could not believe that the saber technique he had used with all his might was easily neutralized by the Domain Master of Qingfeng. The strength that the Domain Master of Qingfeng had shown was definitely not at the 7th level of the Divine King realm. That was the strength and means that only a peak Divine King could have. The Celestial King realized that something was wrong and his eyes fell on the pitch-black divine sword in Ji Tianqing's right hand. No. Old thief Qingfeng's natal divine weapon is not a divine sword. With the Celestial King's insight and keen intuition, he immediately realized the crux of the problem. You are not the Domain Master of Qingfeng. You are just impersonating. No, you have taken over his body? The Celestial King opened his eyes wide and glared at Ji Tianqing, roaring furiously. Suddenly he realized that the pitch-black, quaint divine ship looked familiar. He had seen it somewhere before. At this moment Ji Tianqing stopped pretending and sneered. "Ha! Haven't you always boasted that you are shrewd and resourceful? Why did you only realize the problem now? Don't you think it's too late?" There was no doubt that he admitted that he was not the Domain Master of Qingfeng, but that he had taken over this body. The Celestial King widened his eyes in shock and looked at him incredulously. He asked tentatively, You are Kenshin Ryushin? The reason why he guessed the answer so quickly was that Ji Tianqing had used his original voice to speak. The second reason was that the quaint pitch-black divine sword was Kenshin's unique sword, the Burial of Heaven. More than 1,000 years ago, countless heroes and experts in the heavenly realm had been defeated by that sword. In the War of the Gods 1,100 years ago, countless gods had fallen under the Burial of Heaven's sword. The description of the Burial of Heaven's sword had always been accompanied by the legends of Kenshin and had been passed down in the heavenly realm for more than 1,000 years. There was a third reason as well. For the past few months, the Domain Master of Qingfeng had been staying in Heaven Capital and had never left. Who could sneak into Heaven Capital silently, kill the Domain Master of Qingfeng and take over his body without alerting anyone? After all, the Domain Master of Qingfeng was a 7th Heaven Realm Upper Divine King. Only a peak Divine King could do all this. In the firmament mainland, other than the Celestial King, there was only one person who could do it. The answer was obvious. It was Kenshin. Since the Celestial King had already guessed the answer, Ji Tianqing nodded and admitted it. Yes, I am Kenshin Ryushin. How is it? Are you surprised? Chapter 43:28. There was no surprise. There was only unparalleled shock and horror. The Celestial King's face turned as pale as a sheet of paper, even a little twisted. Anger, panic, shock, disbelief and other emotions all gathered on his face and eyes. No matter how careful he was, he still fell into Kenshin's trap. He had deduced and imagined countless times what kind of tricks Kenshin would use to deal with him. But he never would have thought that the Sword God would use such a dangerous and difficult scheme. Kenshin was so close to inciting the Domain Lord's alliance to kill him and the Imperial Guards. He was so close to dying under Kenshin's sword, thinking that he was killed by the Domain Lord of Qingfeng. Fortunately, at the most critical moment he finally saw through Kenshin's plot. Phew, the Celestial King breathed a sigh of relief. He secretly rejoiced and showed an expression of relief. His anger, panic and shock gradually subsided. He calmed down and stared at Ji Tianqing with a sneer. Kenshin, you are indeed a legendary expert. You can always create miracles and shock everyone. I have to say, this scheme of yours is beyond my expectations and I'm filled with admiration. But do you think you have won? I am the overlord of the Firmament continent. Do you think I will be defeated so easily? You are too naive. The Celestial King, who had calmed down, regained his confidence. You should know that I have 4 war marshals, 2 protectors, the governor and deputy governor of the Imperial Guards and many immortal generals. But have you seen the other 3 war marshals after killing War Marshal Nanfeng? And have you seen the 2 protectors after possessing the Domain Lord of Qingfeng and hiding in Heaven Capital for so long? Upon hearing this, Ji Tianqing raised his eyebrows and nodded slightly. Indeed, I did have some doubts before. The Rebel Alliance has divided into more than a dozen groups and occupied so many domain chiefs' manors one after another. Yet they were not attacked by the 3 battle commanders. After I infiltrated Heaven Capital, I didn't see any battle marshal. I only saw God King Feng Yi, the governor and deputy governor of the Forbidden Army, and those god generals. Now I finally understand. The 3 battle commanders and the 2 guardians should be hiding in your body, right? Just like the thousands of disciples of the 4 forces, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu and the others who stayed in Ji Tianqing's divine artifact, they could follow him at all times and be very hidden. The Celestial King sneered. Kenshin is Kenshin. You can see through it with just a hint. After saying that, he took out a green-skinned gourd with sparkling green light in his left hand and shouted, "Come out." As he released his divine power and opened up the space inside the green gourd, several divine lights flashed out. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. As the divine lights flashed, 5 god kings with different appearances appeared next to the Celestial King. 2 of them were old men in purple robes with divine crowns on their heads. They looked very respectable and sage-like. Ji Tianqing had taken the divine soul memories of the territorial lord of Qingfeng and battle commander Nanfeng. Naturally, he recognized them as the 2 guardians of Heaven Capital. As for the other 3 god kings, they were all tall and burly middle-aged men. 2 of them looked rugged and heroic while the other one looked handsome and heroic. Needless to say, these 3 were the 3 battle commanders. It was worth mentioning that all 5 of them were LV9 god kings. They were the strongest pillars under the Celestial King's command. Just a moment ago the Celestial King was facing Ji Tianqing alone. Now it was 6 against 1 and they surrounded Ji Tianqing. As expected, I guessed correctly. No wonder you are so confident. Ji Tianqing's gaze swept across the crowd. He smiled coldly and fearlessly. The 3 battle commanders and the 2 guardians did not speak. They just silently held their divine weapons and slowly circled around Ji Tianqing. The 5 of them connected with the Celestial King's aura and quickly formed a battle formation. They could join forces to cast spells and besiege Ji Tianqing at any time. The Celestial King was very confident. He sneered and said, "Kenshin, it is said that you have surpassed the peak of the God Kings and are infinitely close to the realm of God Emperor. I also admit that you are definitely stronger than me. However, with me, these 5 experts and 10,000 Imperial Guards, you will definitely lose." It was obvious that even though the Celestial King was very confident, he was still holding back. He did not dare to speak too confidently. He only dared to say that Kenshin would definitely lose. He did not dare to say that Kenshin would definitely die. Ji Tianqing was not alone. He could summon at least thousands of elite experts and dozens of god kings from the divine weapons he carried with him. However, he did not intend to do so. It just so happens that I have not had a chance to display my abilities. Today I can use you guys to test how much I have improved. Ji Tianqing's left hand quickly accumulated violent divine power. He used the dragon elephant divine fist to attack the two guardians. He waved his sword in his right hand and sword radiance filled the sky. He attacked the three battle commanders and the celestial king. He was fighting 1 against 6. He did not hold back anymore. He used all his divine powers and secret techniques. His entire body emitted a formless, mighty divine power. Instantly, the three battle commanders and the two guardians were shocked by his formless divine power. Their faces turned pale and their movements became slightly sluggish. The celestial king was the strongest, but he was also affected. He could not circulate his power smoothly. Even so, the 6 of them did not panic. They had sufficient strength and battle experience. They quickly used the battle formation to link their divine power. Together they formed an oval defensive shield. Bam bam bam. Rumble. The divine powers unleashed by the two sides clashed violently in the void, releasing dazzling 5-colored shockwaves that spread in all directions. Ji Tianqing's divine powers and sword radiance destroyed the divine powers of the 6 people. He then hit the defensive shield. Cracking sounds could be heard, and the defensive shield that the 6 of them had temporarily condensed was filled with cracks. Without a doubt, even if Ji Tianqing was fighting 1 against 6, he would still have the upper hand. This was the first official battle between the two sides. The 6 of them realized how terrifying Kenshin's abilities were. They looked serious. They focused even more on casting their divine powers to block Ji Tianqing's attacks. Originally, the Celestial King wanted to use this opportunity to send a message to God King Fengyi. He wanted God King Fengyi to announce to the tens of thousands of soldiers that Kenshin had taken over the body of Lord Qingfeng. Many of the lords and soldiers had been used by Kenshin. Not only did he want to expose Kenshin's scheme, but he also wanted God King Fengyi to bring many divine generals and imperial guards to attack Kenshin. This was the best opportunity for him to kill Kenshin. Unfortunately, Kenshin's continuous attacks prevented him from being distracted. Naturally, he did not have the chance to send a message for help. Chapter 43-29. The battle formation formed by the Celestial King, the left and right protectors, and the 3 commander-in-chief was destroyed by Ji Tianqing in just 10 moves. The 3 commander-in-chief were younger and weaker, so they became the breakthrough point. 2 of them were injured by Ji Tianqing while the other was beaten back. His face was pale and his divine power was in disorder. After destroying the battle formation of the 6 experts, Ji Tianqing could no longer let them form a battle formation together. Through the previous 10 moves, he had also tested his own combat power and had an answer. Therefore, he did not waste any more time and tried to end the battle as quickly as possible. Sword Rain. Ji Tianqing bellowed. He pointed the sword of burial of heaven at the boundless void and used this divine power unique skill. In the depths of the boundless void, tens of thousands of starlight spots lit up and rained down like a meteor shower. Ji Tianqing used this divine power unique skill mainly to borrow the power of the extraterritorial stars. No matter where he was, he could control the extraterritorial stars. Now that he was in the starry sky, it was naturally easier to use this skill. The sword rain was also more powerful. Swish, swish, swish. In the blink of an eye, 90,000 starlight spots came close and covered a radius of 20,000 miles. The Celestial King and the others finally saw clearly that they were giant starry swords. Each of the giant swords was extremely sharp and contained powerful divine might and sword intent. The 6 experts realized that something was wrong. Their faces changed as they shouted anxiously. Get out of the way. Retreat. However, the giant starry swords were descending too quickly. They could not dodge in time. They were in the void and they could not use the power of space to teleport. No matter how fast they flew, they could not be faster than the giant starry swords. Moreover, the 90,000 giant starry swords released a powerful suppressive force that covered the area. The Celestial King and the 5 experts spread out, but they could not escape the range of the sword rain. Bang, bang, bang. Boom 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 boom. With a deafening boom, the 6 experts were drowned out by the starry sword rain. They endured the attacks of countless starry swords. The Celestial King was the most powerful of them all. With his powerful foundation and numerous protective artifacts, he was able to withstand the bombardment of the rain of swords. The left and right protectors were also barely able to block the rain of swords. They used their ultimate skills and borrowed the power of their protective artifacts to protect their vitals, so they only suffered light injuries. However, the outcome of the three battle commanders was rather tragic. They were already injured and now they were being killed by countless starry swords. Their godly powers were quickly being depleted and all kinds of defensive means were collapsing. The first round of bombardment from the rain of swords had already caused them to be covered in wounds and bloodstains, making them look extremely miserable. Nearly 30,000 starry swords were shattered after the first round of bombardment. The remaining 60,000 starry swords danced and shuttled back and forth, forming a gigantic sword formation that began to strangle the Celestial King and the others. Swish, 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 swish. The sword flashes shuttled back and forth, and the sharp sound of the air being torn apart was constantly heard. Celestial King and the others were under tremendous pressure, and they desperately tried to cast spells to resist. Even though the Celestial King had cast spells to protect himself, he had also helped the three commander-in-chief to reduce the pressure on them. However, his strength was limited in the end and he was unable to ensure the safety of the three commanders. After a full 3 breaths, the sword formation gradually dissipated, and the sword light that filled the sky also quickly disappeared. The figures of the Celestial King and the others reappeared in the void. At this time, the Celestial King had only suffered some minor injuries. He looked a little disheveled, but it was nothing serious. The left and right protectors, on the other hand, were pale and gasping for breath. They had used up too much of their divine power and suffered some minor injuries. Their clothes were tattered and stained with blood. The ones with the worst outcome were naturally the 3 battle marshals. All 3 of them were heavily injured. Not only were they covered in blood and wounds, some of them even had their limbs cut off. Their combat power had been greatly reduced, and one of the battle marshals who had lost an arm could not even continue fighting. This result shocked the Celestial King and the others, and they were also very worried. Even though they were already mentally prepared and knew that Kenshin was very powerful. However, they did not expect Kenshin to be so powerful. Fighting 1 against 6, he was still able to beat them into such a miserable state in just 10 breaths. The result was no longer suspenseful. The 6 of them together were no match for Kenshin. In the past, it was rumored that Kenshin's strength was infinitely close to that of the 5 god emperors. When the Celestial King and the others heard this, they naturally refused to believe it. While they maintained a skeptical attitude, they also maintained a mocking attitude. But now reality proved that the rumors were true. Therefore, the Celestial King ordered the left and right protectors and the 3 commanders to besiege Kenshin at all costs. They had to delay him. And he wanted to take this opportunity to send out a communication jade slip, asking God King Fingi to lead a large number of experts and imperial guards to support him. From the current situation, if no strong reinforcements came, the 6 of them would very likely die in the void. However, on the surface, Xianxia was going all out to kill the 3 commanders and reduce their numbers as quickly as possible. However, he kept a close eye on the Celestial King and was determined not to give him a chance to send out a message for help. Even though the left and right protectors and the 3 commanders endured their injuries and fearlessly launched a joint attack, Xianxia continuously teleported and skillfully avoided the joint attack of the 5 experts, and appeared in front of the Celestial King again. The Celestial King had just taken out his communication jade slip and was about to send out a message for help. Suddenly, a dazzling sword light slashed at his face and went straight for his head. The Celestial King was enveloped by the sword intent and felt a chill run down his back, as if he saw death descending. Once again he was faced with 2 choices. He could either give up his life or give up his communication jade slip. At this moment of life and death, he almost did not consider and chose to save his life without hesitation. After all, he called for God King Fingi to lead the army to support him in order to save his life. If he were to lose his life in order to send out a message, it would be putting the cart before the horse. Crack. At this critical moment, the Celestial King luckily dodged the attack of the Burial of Heaven, but the jade slip was cut into pieces and splattered everywhere. The Celestial King who had dodged the attack was very angry. He could only join forces with the other 5 experts and continue to fight Xianxia. He carried 3 special communication jade slips with him. Now that 2 of them were destroyed, there was only 1 left. He secretly made up his mind that if he could not find a suitable opportunity and was not confident enough, he would not easily take out the 3rd communication jade slip. If the last communication jade slip was also destroyed, then he would have no chance at all. After all, only a specially made communication jade slip could hope to send out a message. Even if he sent out an ordinary communication jade slip, it would be blocked by Ji Tianxing. The battle continued. Both sides were constantly flashing in the void, shuttling back and forth. They were so fast that their figures could not be seen clearly, only leaving behind streaks of light. Bookhouse Reading Website. Chapter 43:30. Time passed quietly. The battle between Ji Tianxing and the Celestial King and the others caused a huge commotion in the void. Countless divine lights and raging flames burst forth. The area within a radius of 50,000 miles was enveloped by the five-colored divine light, and deafening loud noises constantly burst forth. After 100 breaths, the commander-in-chief whose arms and legs had been cut off was the first to die under the sword of the burial of heaven. He was killed by Ji Tianxing on the spot. His godhead collapsed and more than 20 pieces of godhead fragments spilled out. They were all collected by Ji Tianxing. There were only 5 people left on the Celestial King's side, and all of them were injured. As the battle continued, the injuries of the 5 people continued to worsen, and their strength rapidly weakened. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing was not only unharmed, but even his divine power and aura were as stable as before. The more the Celestial King fought, the more frightened he became and the more desperate he became. After another 100 breaths, the second commander-in-chief was also killed by Ji Tianxing. His godhead collapsed and his divine body turned into fine powder that scattered in the void. After a quarter of an hour, the third commander-in-chief followed in the footsteps of his companions. Due to his serious injuries, his divine body collapsed and his godhead escaped. However, it was intercepted and killed by Ji Tianxing. The 3 commander-in-chief were killed one after another, and only the left and right protectors and the Celestial King were left to fight side by side. At this time, the left and right protectors were also seriously injured and their strength was weak. Even the Celestial King was already riddled with wounds after exchanging more than 10 blows with Ji Tianxing in the previous battle. He knew that Ji Tianxing had been watching him all along, and did not give him a chance to send a message for help. Therefore he did his best to hold back Ji Tianxing, and let the left and right protectors find a chance to send a message for help. This idea was not bad, but unfortunately the left and right protectors were not strong enough. In other words, Ji Tianxing's strength was too strong. The left and right protectors could not find a suitable opportunity. At the last moment they could not wait any longer. They could only take the risk and send a message by force. However, they were also stopped by Ji Tianxing. The result made the Celestial King very angry and very sad. Not only did Ji Tianxing stop the left protector from sending the message, but he also used the god-slaying sword to cut the left protector in half. When the left protector's body was destroyed, his godhead immediately flew out and fled to the god world. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, was prepared for this. He waved his sword and shattered the godhead into pieces. Just like that, the left protector also lost his life. The remaining protector of the right fought side by side with the Celestial King, but he did not last long either. Another few tens of breaths of time passed before he was minced into bits by the sword of burial of heaven as well, and he perished on the spot. The battle stopped and the void also quieted down. Only the Celestial King was left to face Ji Tianxing alone. He was panting as he confronted him. At this time the Celestial King was severely injured. His hair was disheveled and his body was covered in blood. He was extremely embarrassed. His 5 subordinates were killed one after another, which also damaged his confidence and made him completely desperate. You win. The Celestial King stared at Ji Tianxing with dark red eyes. He lifted his sleeve to wipe the blood off his face and said in a low and hoarse voice, "Regardless of strength, means or strategy, you are better than me. I have no shame in losing." Although the Celestial King hated Ji Tianxing and always thought that Ji Tianxing was too despicable and shameless. However, no matter how good a strategy was, in the end, it still required enough strength to end a dispute and establish a victory. Since Kenshin set foot on the firmament continent, the two of them began to compete across the void. He was always in a passive position and had never won a single round against Kenshin. Even if he lost today, he was convinced of his loss. Ji Tianxing stared at him and said calmly, "You should know that I don't take captives and I can't let you live." Indeed, if it were any other soldier or powerhouse, Ji Tianxing could still forgive them and subdue them. However, the Celestial King was the most loyal right-hand man of the Nebula God Emperor. He could not let him live. The Celestial King also understood this. Knowing that he was going to die, he could not surrender to Ji Tianxing, let alone beg for mercy. In the last moments of his life, under the circumstances where no one was watching, he said some of the things that were in his heart. Kenshin, although we are enemies, to be honest, I actually admire you. Whether it was you 1,000 years ago or now. You have subdued the boundless heaven continent and the reincarnation island. After today, the firmament continent will also fall into your hands. Presumably, the chaotic continent and the Qiankun continent will not last long and will eventually be subdued by you. Maybe 2 years later, you will be the overlord of the divine world, more glorious than you were then. But I just want to say that your glory is destined to be short-lived. It will not last long. Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and asked indifferently, "What are you trying to say? Even if I control the divine world, in the end I will still be killed by the five-god emperor?" "That's right." The celestial king nodded and said with a playful smile, "Even if you are very glorious now and can still be glorious for a few years, you are destined to die. And even if I am killed by you today, in a few years, when the great cause of the god emperor is completed, I will be resurrected. You are destined to die and there is no chance for you to be resurrected. And I will be reborn." When the celestial king said these words, he was proud from the bottom of his heart, and there was also a hint of complacency and flaunting. As a result, the anger and despair he felt when he was about to be killed by Ji Tianxing disappeared. However, Ji Tianxing managed to pick up some clues from his words. "According to what I know, even if Dao Xingyun is a god emperor, it is impossible for him to bring you back from the dead. But you are so sure that you will be resurrected in the future. You must have heard some secret from Dao Xingyun." Ji Tianxing frowned and analyzed and immediately guessed the reason. "If I'm not wrong, the reason why you're so proud and confident is because of Dao Nebula's plan in outer space. Did Dao Xingyun reveal to you that the thing he is researching has the effect of bringing the dead back to life?" When he guessed this, Ji Tianxing was also somewhat puzzled and curious. What was the mystery of the gray fog that the five god emperors wanted to explore at all costs? Seeing Ji Tianxing analyze so much information from such a short sentence, the celestial king was also quite shocked and found it hard to believe. But he did not deny or defend himself but laughed coldly and said, "It is so easy to talk to smart people, you guessed right. His Majesty the God Emperor did reveal this secret, but I do not understand his plan. So, don't even think about capturing me, extorting a confession by torture and interrogating me about the secret of that matter. It is all in vain. Besides, even if you know some secrets, so what? Do you dare to leave the God realm and go to the depths of the void to find the five God Emperors? You can only hide in the God realm and pray that they do not come back, then you can live for a few more years." The celestial king did not know that if Ji Tianxing wanted to know the secret in his mind, he did not need to use torture at all, he only needed to refine his divinity. Ji Tianxing didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled nonchalantly and said, "This seat will soon take control of the God realm. Once this matter is over, this seat will head into the depths of the void and deal with the five great God Emperors. But you will not be able to see these things." Chapter 43:31. Ji Tianxing did not waste any more time talking to the celestial king. After that, he waved the sword of burial of heaven and attacked again. This time he was fighting the celestial king one-on-one. Of course, he had an overwhelming advantage over the celestial king. The two had only exchanged 3 moves, but the celestial king was severely injured and vomited blood. He was sent flying dozens of miles away. He had no choice but to use a forbidden technique at the cost of his lifespan to triple his combat power. Empyrean God King was covered in bloody flames. He roared with all his might and charged at Ji Tianxing fearlessly with Heavenly Slayer in his hands. However, it was still futile. Even if his combat power had tripled, he was still no match for Ji Tianxing. After all, Ji Tianxing's strength had been strengthened to more than 50 times that of an ordinary peak divine king. And the celestial king was one of those ordinary peak divine kings. In front of Ji Tianxing, he was only a unit of measurement. Sword of Daylight. Ji Tianxing let out a low growl. He held the Heaven Barrier sword in his hand and stabbed out at a moderate speed. A cold light bloomed and expanded at an incredible speed. It was as if a blazing sun had appeared out of nowhere. The huge blazing sun not only lit up the void, but it also blocked the celestial king's attack and engulfed his figure. Boom! The two collided and an earth-shattering explosion spread in the void. When the divine light dissipated, the celestial king's figure appeared. His body was covered with cracks and burning with dark red flames. He was hunched into a ball. The terrifying sword light and the invisible sword intent pierced through and tore apart his divine body, severing his meridians and bones. He relied on his vigorous divine power to support his divine body and prevent it from collapsing. But now his injuries were so severe that he could collapse at any time. Damn it! His cracked face twisted as he cursed in a muffled voice. Blood gushed out from his 7 orifices. Tianxia didn't answer. He held the sword of burial of heaven and walked closer. The celestial king no longer had the strength to escape. Even if he could send out a message for help before he died, it would be an extravagant hope. When he saw Tianxia walking toward him, gathering invisible divine power and aura, and raising the sword of burial of heaven, he was filled with despair. The only thing he could do was to hold the heavenly slayer divine saber tightly with both hands, unleash all the remaining power in his body, and let out the most tragic and stirring roar. Ah! With a sorrowful and powerful roar, the celestial king held the divine blade with both hands, straightened his body and charged toward Tianxia. Shwa! Swish! Swish! A 10,000-foot-long purple blade aura with endless divine power cut through the void. 3 sacred and dazzling golden sword auras cut through the void and slashed toward the blade aura and the blood-colored figure below it. Bang! 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 The next moment the blade auras and the sword auras collided with each other. There was a loud bang and divine light fragments all over the sky. The blade auras shattered but the sword auras were intact. Only the golden light dimmed a little and its power was reduced by 30%. But the 3 blade auras still destroyed the celestial king's divine body. Blood splattered. The celestial king's divine body was reduced to ashes by the golden light and scattered in the void. Even his godhead was severely damaged by the sword light, and his godhead was severely damaged. After his divine spark was severely damaged, the celestial king's consciousness was temporarily unconscious. He floated in the void in a daze and forgot to escape. There was no deep hatred between Tianxia and him. At most, during the War of the Gods 1,000 years ago, the celestial king had followed the nebula god emperor to deal with him. But back then the celestial king was too weak to be of much use, so Tianxia did not remember this person. Therefore, now that the celestial king was at the end of his rope, Tianxia did not mock or ridicule him. He silently raised the burial of heaven and slashed again. Crack! With a crisp shattering sound, the celestial king's divine spark shattered into a dozen pieces. The battle was over. Tianxia put away the burial of heaven and collected the celestial king's divine spark fragments, the interspatial ring, and the Heaven's Slayer divine saber before returning to the god world. He did not forget that God King Fingy, the Imperial Guards, and the tens of thousands of members of the Domain Lord Alliance were still waiting for the result. Half an hour had passed since the Celestial King and the Domain Lord of Light Breeze left. God King Fingy, the Divine Generals and thousands of Imperial Guards were still waiting in formation. On the other side, dozens of Domain Lords and more than 10,000 soldiers of the Domain Lord Alliance were also waiting silently. Originally, when the incident happened, there were only about 20 Domain Lords leading their subordinates to the scene. But in the last half an hour, more than 30 Domain Lords and Divine Kings had arrived. Except for a few who were not present, all the Domain Lords and leaders of the Domain Lord Alliance were present. Unlike the Imperial Guards and God King Fingy who were patient and silent, the people of the Domain Lord Alliance were anxious and worried. Many of them were whispering to each other or discussing in whispers or voice transmissions. After all, everyone was sure that the Domain Lord of Light Breeze was going to die. The Domain Lords and leaders of the Domain Lord Alliance had to consider what to do when the Celestial King returned. As the leader of the Domain Lord Alliance, the Domain Lord of Light Breeze was killed by the Celestial King in the extraterritorial starry sky. This was equivalent to killing a chicken to warn the monkeys. When the Domain Lords faced the Celestial King again, should they admit defeat or continue to resist? If they admitted defeat, the Empyrean God King would use the most ruthless methods to control them and ensure their loyalty after making a mistake once. Secondly, the Celestial King would hate them even more. It was unknown whether they could continue to be Domain Lords in the future. If they continued to resist the Celestial King, who would be the leader of the Domain Lord Alliance? Besides the Domain Lord of Light Breeze, there were 3 other highly respected and powerful Domain Lords in the Alliance. Therefore, Dozens of domain lords were secretly discussing which domain lord should be elected as the leader. Some of the domain lords were wavering and could not make up their minds. They planned to wait for the Celestial King to return and see how the Celestial King would react. They would then deal with it. 45 minutes had passed. Everyone estimated that the domain lord of Light Breeze should be dead and the Celestial King should be back. Sure enough, a crack appeared in the space barrier in the sky, and a sacred golden light lit up. Everyone looked up at the sky, waiting for the Celestial King to appear. However, a thin figure passed through the crack and descended from the sky. It was an old man with white hair and a beard. He was thin but tall and his face was thin but firm. It was not the Celestial King, but the domain lord of Light Breeze. He was still alive and his clothes were neat and tidy. There was not even a wound on his body. Seeing this, everyone was dumbfounded. Chapter 43-32. No one had expected the territorial lord to come back alive. Seeing that he was unscathed as if he had not been through a battle, everyone had the same thought. Could it be that under the threat of death, the realm lord of Clearwind finally backed down and surrendered to Empyrean God King? No wonder they thought so. No one believed that the territorial lord could defeat the Celestial King. Since the territorial lord of Lightwind was still alive, there was only one answer. He had surrendered. But when they thought of this, new questions popped up in their minds. Since the territorial lord has surrendered, why did he come back alone? Where is the Celestial King? Why didn't he show up? After the territorial lord of Lightwind entered Divine Capital, the spatial crack in the firmament quickly closed. The Celestial King did not show up even when the territorial lord came to the scene. More than 20,000 people finally came to their senses from the shock and astonishment. All eyes were focused on the territorial lord of Lightwind. Countless people voiced their doubts. Territorial lord, why did you come back alone? Where is the Divine King? The first to ask was Divine King Fingy. He knew better than anyone else that this was strange. He knew that the Celestial King was not alone. The 2 guardians and 3 generals were hidden in the divine weapon he carried with him. Any one of them could easily kill the Realm Lord of Lightwind. Territorial Lord, why did you come back? Did you surrender to the Celestial King? Territorial Lord, you are our senior. We have always respected you. If you cower at the last moment and surrender to Empyrean God King, that doesn't represent our intentions. That's right. We don't blame you for being a coward. But you can't make the decision for us. Many of the territorial lords asked the territorial lord what was going on. Even more territorial lords expressed that they wanted to distance themselves from the territorial lord. All in all, the scene was a little chaotic. Ji Tianqing looked indifferent. He still maintained the usual posture and expression of the territorial lord. He looked down at everyone and said calmly, "This old man knows that everyone has a lot of questions in their hearts and can't wait to know the results." However, this was not the place to talk. Things were a little complicated. Divine King Feng Yi, the Divine Generals, the Imperial Guard's Deputy Governor, the Domain Lords and the people in charge, please follow this old man to the Great Meeting Hall and let this old man explain in detail. After the previous battle, this place had long been reduced to ruins. With more than 20,000 people gathered here, it was indeed not a suitable place to speak. Therefore, Ji Tianqing's suggestion to bring the experts from both sides to the conference hall was reasonable and reasonable. No one would doubt it. But the experts on God King Feng Yi's side and the Domain Lords Alliance's side all felt that something was amiss. The experts from both sides were hesitant. They looked at each other and whispered to each other. They couldn't make up their minds. There were also many experts who shouted loudly, asking Ji Tianqing what had happened. If the Celestial King and the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord had appeared together and said that they would bring everyone to explain, no one would have any doubts. However, the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord alone was enough to make people scratch their heads. Ji Tianqing had sufficient experience in dealing with this kind of situation. He knew very well that the more he explained and persuaded, the more suspicious he would be. Therefore, he ignored the hesitation of the crowd and ignored the shouts and questions of the Domain Lords. He turned and flew to the Great Meeting Hall. No one stopped him. Everyone stared at his back with a pained expression. What should we do? What is this old man doing? He's being so mysterious. Is there something he can't say here? What's there to guess? He must have surrendered to the Celestial King. Nonsense, we all know this result. But where did the Celestial King go? Don't you want to know? The experts from both sides were discussing endlessly, but they still couldn't make up their minds. When Ji Tianqing's back disappeared into the horizon, some experts finally couldn't hold it in anymore. They got up and flew to the sky, heading to Heavenly God Palace. I would like to see what the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord wants to say. Isn't it just going to Heavenly God Palace? What's there to be afraid of? What are you hesitating about? As the domain lords and god generals flew to the sky one after another and headed to Heavenly God Palace, more people dispelled their worries. Especially after God King Fengyi turned and left, the governor and vice-governor of the Imperial Guard hurriedly followed him. As a result, the god generals and experts under the Celestial King all rushed to Heavenly God Palace. The thousands of Imperial Guards also turned and left the ruins. They rushed to guard outside Heavenly God Palace and awaited orders. Since God King Fengyi and the others had left, the people from the Domain Lords Alliance couldn't just stand there. Most of the Domain Lords rushed to Heavenly God Palace in groups to see what the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord wanted to do. Only a few Domain Lords chose to observe and wait for the results. When Ji Tianqing arrived at Heavenly God Palace, the Imperial Guards and God Kings guarding the palace were shocked. Many people had received the news that the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord and the Celestial King had gone to the extraterritorial cosmos to settle their grudges. However, the Cool Breeze Territorial Lord had returned unscathed and even wanted to enter the meeting hall. The Imperial Guards and God Kings hesitated. They were all hesitating if they should make a move. Soon God King Fengyi arrived with many experts. After receiving God King Fengyi's orders, the Imperial Guards guarding the door opened the door and allowed Ji Tianqing to enter. Ji Tianqing entered Heavenly God Palace without saying a word. He walked straight to the seat of honor and stood still below the throne. Then he lowered his eyelids and waited silently. God King Fengyi and his god generals tried to probe Ji Tianqing multiple times. They wanted to know what he wanted to do. However, Ji Tianqing didn't say a word. He didn't answer them either, which whetted everyone's appetite. It wasn't long before a few tens of region lords and leaders of the Domain Lords Alliance stepped into the hall successively. These experts had endured until now. Finally, they couldn't suppress their curiosity and started to question Ji Tianqing. The originally silent main hall immediately became noisy. Ji Tianqing looked up and swept his gaze across everyone calmly. When he saw that 70% of the experts in Heavenly Capital were gathered here, he thought to himself, "Success." Therefore he waved his hand and shot out a ray of divine light to close the door of the meeting hall. This was a normal action. He didn't want to be disturbed and didn't want his secret to be leaked. Many experts didn't care about this detail. They all stared at him and waited for his explanation. Ji Tianqing revealed an inexplicable smile and said, "Almost everyone is here. I won't take up any more of your time. Next, please be mentally prepared. I'm going to announce an earth-shattering news." Everyone's hearts were in their mouths. They held their breaths and listened attentively. As a result, many people ignored his self-address. He no longer called himself Old Man, but Book Guest Residence Reading Website. Chapter 43-33. The main hall was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard. Everyone held their breaths and looked at Ji Tianqing, waiting for his so-called big news. Ji Tianqing's smile grew wider. His palms shone with divine light as he took out two items. One was a divine saber with bloodstains, and the other was a shard of a divine spark that shone with divine light. Celestial King has been killed by me. When the divine saber and the shard of a divine spark appeared, everyone's eyes widened as they stared at the two items. When Ji Tianqing said this, everyone's expression changed drastically, revealing a horrified expression. Everyone in the main hall was dumbfounded. They were dumbfounded and their hearts were in turmoil. For a moment they were stunned and their minds went blank. It was indeed a big news. It was as if the sky had collapsed and the god realm was destroyed. It was incomparably shocking and absurd. If Ji Tianqing was just making empty promises, everyone would quickly recover from their shock and treat it as a joke. However, Ji Tianqing took out two items first. One was a divine saber and the other was a shard of a divine spark. These two items were not unfamiliar to the strong practitioners in the main hall because they contained the aura of Celestial King. The divine saber was Celestial King's natal artifact, the King-grade Heavenly Slayer divine saber. As for the shard of a divine spark, it was indeed Celestial King's divine spark. Even the divine spark had turned into a pile of shards. There was no doubt that Celestial King had completely fallen. But how was this possible? The Clear Wind Region Governor was only a 7th-degree realm god king. Even if Celestial King did not retaliate, it was impossible for him to be killed. What was going on? Everyone wanted to listen to the Clear Wind Region Governor's explanation to solve their doubts. Now they were all stunned and even more confused. God King Feng Yi, who knew the inside story, was the one who was most shocked and felt that this matter was the most absurd. The Celestial King was not alone. He had the left and right protectors and the 3 generals of war with him. Those 5 powerhouses were the strongest under Empyrean God King's command. Since the Celestial King had been killed, the other 5 must be dead as well. But this was still too preposterous. No one could believe it no matter what. At the same time, Ji Tianxing took advantage of the fact that everyone was shocked and in a daze to summon a pitch-black divine bell. The primordial chaos bell. Shua. Under his control, the primordial chaos bell flew out of the main hall and instantly expanded to a radius of 100 miles, enveloping the entire heavenly deity palace. The divine bell flickered with a cold, pitch-black light. It emitted an unparalleled divine might, sealing and suppressing the entire heavenly deity palace. Even the more than 3,000 imperial guards guarding outside the divine palace were included in the divine palace. For a moment, the area within a radius of 100 miles was plunged into darkness. Everyone was suppressed by an invisible divine power. The 3,000 imperial guards were in a mess. They were all shouting loudly. Some even wanted to rush into the main hall to ask for instructions from the Imperial Guard's governor. In the meeting hall, the dozens of experts seemed to have woken up from a dream. They finally regained their composure from the shock. Everyone was on high alert. They looked at Ji Tianxing cautiously and asked him in a deep voice what he was going to do. The experts, led by Supreme Being Feng Yi, even took out their Kenshin swords and pointed them at Ji Tianxing. The reason why Ji Tianxing had lured everyone here was that he wanted to kill all the experts in one fell swoop. As long as he got rid of the experts in the main hall, he would be able to take over Heaven Capital and take over the entire firmament mainland. However, it was not easy to get rid of so many upper and middle god kings. No matter how powerful he was, he could not guarantee that no one would escape if he did not put in some effort. Therefore, he had shocked everyone by revealing the news of the Celestial King's death. While everyone was still in a daze, he took out the primordial chaos bell and sealed the entire heavenly palace. This matter was in the bag. Overall, from the moment he decided to lure and kill the Celestial King, he had already thought of the follow-up plan. This series of plans was very dangerous, exciting and difficult. There could not be any mistakes. However, once the plan succeeded, the result would be shocking and amazing. If he could get rid of the Celestial King and tens of thousands of soldiers by himself and take over Heaven Capital, it would be a miracle that would shake the entire realm of the gods. Now the plan was more than half completed. The miracle was about to happen. Ji Tianxing looked at Supreme Being Feng Yi and the rest who were on high alert. He then looked at the dominators who were still in a daze and had complicated expressions. He smiled from the bottom of his heart. Oh yes, let me add one more thing. The Celestial King was not alone. The left and right protectors and the 3 generals were hidden in the divine weapon that he carried with him. Unfortunately, the 2 protectors and the 3 generals were killed by me long before the Celestial King. After that, he put away the Celestial King's relics and showed the godhead fragments of the 2 protectors and the 3 generals. Even though this was shocking news, everyone's hearts were already numb from the shock they had just experienced. They were more concerned about how the Dominator of Light Wind did it. Supreme Being Feng Yi quickly calmed down. He stared at Ji Tianxing and asked in a deep voice, "You are not the Dominator of Light Wind. Who are you?" Everyone in the hall knew that the Dominator of Light Wind was not powerful enough to kill the Celestial King and the others. Therefore, the question that Supreme Being Feng Yi asked was what everyone was thinking. Ji Tianxing looked at Supreme Being Feng Yi and said with a playful smile, "That's right. I am not the Dominator of Light Wind. In the entire firmament mainland, who else could kill the Celestial King and the 5 generals by himself? Now I have a big surprise for all of you." As he finished speaking, he left the body of the Dominator of Light Wind and returned to his original body. Zhou. A handsome young man in a white robe with black hair appeared. He exuded an invisible sacred aura and a vast aura that could suppress heaven and earth. He stopped hiding and openly revealed his true self. Then he casually tossed the body of the territorial Lord of Light Wind aside. At this moment the hall fell silent again. The dozens of Supreme Being experts were stunned. After a breath, they were all shocked and could not help but exclaim. "Hey! You are Kenshin. Hey! No wonder. Ah! This is ridiculous. We have been fooled and used. This is all Kenshin's scheme. Kenshin, you are the one behind this. Kenshin, you are too despicable." While the powerhouses who were suddenly enlightened exclaimed in surprise, some of them beat their chests and stomped their feet in frustration. Some of them even cursed angrily. The truth was in front of them. Kenshin had taken over the body of the dominator of Lightwind a long time ago. And what happened a while ago, the various conflicts between the two sides were all planned and guided by the Sword God. The Celestial King had suffered a crushing defeat and the Dominator Alliance had been used. They had become sinners. And now, the Sword God had sealed everyone in Dutian Divine Palace. He was probably going to exterminate them all. Chapter 43-34. Everyone thought that the Clear Wind Region Lord was already possessed by Kenshin. This was the truth, but it was not a surprise. To everyone this was definitely a shock. After realizing this, everyone was so angry that they were trembling, their hearts were trembling with fear. Unknowingly, Divine King Feng Yi and his generals were actually standing on the same side as the region lords of the Domain Lord Alliance. Previously, Kenshin was nowhere to be found and did not attack, so both sides still had the energy to fight. But now, the Celestial King, the left and right protectors and the 3 battle marshals had all been killed. The truth was out, Kenshin had appeared, both sides were facing a life and death crisis, so they naturally stood on the same side. There was no other way. Kenshin tricked everyone into the Heavenly God Palace and used a powerful divine weapon to seal the entire palace, wanting to kill everyone in one fell swoop. After the shock and fear, the experts gradually calmed down. At the crucial moment, Divine King Feng Yi was calm enough to stand up and take charge of the situation. He looked at Ji Tianxing fearlessly and said, "Kenshin, I have to say your strength, methods and schemes have all exceeded our expectations. You are indeed very strong, but you are too confident, too arrogant. No matter how strong you are still only one person. And all of us here are Divine King experts, there are over 100 of us. No matter how strong you are, can you withstand the attacks of so many of us?" His words were directed at Ji Tianxing, but they were also directed at the other domain masters and domain masters. Seeing the hesitation of the region lords and leaders, he added, "Everyone, Kenshin clearly wants to kill all of us in one fell swoop. Now that things have come to this, we should put down our differences and work together to deal with Kenshin. We can only talk about other things after we save our lives." It was impossible for the region lords and leaders not to understand such a simple logic. They were only in awe of Kenshin's strength. They were afraid of Kenshin's reputation, that was why they were hesitating. God King Feng Yi had already made things clear. No matter how much they feared Kenshin, no matter if they resisted or not, they would not be able to escape death. Since that was the case, what reason did they have not to resist with all their might? God King Feng Yi wanted to turn the tide and gather everyone's strength to deal with Ji Tianxing. Of course, this was within Ji Tianxing's expectations. He revealed a cold smile and said, "Divine King Feng Yi, since you know that Celestial King appears to be alone, but he actually has 2 protectors and 3 battle marshals with him, then why don't you tell me? Then have you ever thought that I only look like a single person on the surface, but in reality, I have an army of thousands with me?" The moment these words came out, Divine King Feng Yi's body trembled. His expression became extremely ugly. Of course, he had guessed this possibility, but he did not want to affect the morale of the army, so he deliberately ignored this matter. And the fact that Kenshin had brought this up in front of everyone proved that Kenshin really did have an army of thousands with him. They had over 100 Divine King powerhouses joining hands to deal with Kenshin alone. They still had hopes of winning. But if Kenshin had an army of thousands to assist in battle, then they would absolutely have no chance and might even be slaughtered to death. At the thought of this, Divine King Feng Yi's complexion turned deathly pale. His forehead also broke out in cold sweat. Many of the generals and region lords were even more hesitant, not knowing what to do. At this time, Ji Tianxing struck while the iron was hot again and said to everyone, "Divine King Feng Yi is just exaggerating to scare people. Everyone don't need to be anxious. I believe that you all have heard how I dealt with those region lords when I subdued the boundless heaven continent and reincarnation island. As long as it's not stubbornly resisting to the death, as long as they sincerely repent and pledge loyalty, I will accept them all. In fact, the vast majority of the region lords can maintain their original positions and continue to be their region lords. Therefore, all the region lords and decision makers, if you want to live, preserve your positions and foundations, then hurry up and surrender. Several dozen region lords and various major factions decision makers, after hearing this, their eyes immediately lit up, revealing a thick look of hope. They had no choice. There were only two things that they were most concerned about. First, their lives. Would Kenshin kill all of them? Second, their positions and power. If they could survive and continue to be region lords, that would be the best. Other than these two things, nothing else mattered. It was the same to them who they were loyal to and who they worked for. Therefore, several region lords looked at each other, whispered to each other, and discussed for a while. Then many region lords scrambled to be the first to pledge their allegiance. Master Kenshin, we are willing to pledge our allegiance to you and carry out your orders to save the billions of people in the boundless heaven continent and benefit the common people. The Celestial King is already dead. Do you all still want to be blindly loyal to him and be buried with him? Master Kenshin is the embodiment of justice, the Son of Heaven. It is only right for us to pledge our allegiance to him. Master Kenshin, I was too muddle-headed in the past. Now that I have heard your words, it is as if I have been enlightened. I have decided to turn over a new leaf. Please give me a chance. One by one, the region lords stood up with different expressions on their faces, their mouths saying all kinds of words. However, they only had one goal, and that was to pledge their allegiance to Ji Tianxing in order to preserve their lives and their position as region lords. In just 20 breaths of time, more than 30 region lords had chosen to surrender and pledge their allegiance. The remaining region lords and decision-makers were a little hesitant at first. However, when they saw their companions surrendering one after another, their determination wavered and they also declared their allegiance. Just like that, all the region lords and leaders under the Domain Lord Alliance decided to pledge their allegiance to Kenshin. Feng Yi, on the other hand, looked embarrassed and did not say anything for a long time. The governor of the Imperial Army and many divine generals also looked gloomy and did not say a word. The people of the Domain Lord Alliance did not have much loyalty to Celestial King. Of course, they could shamelessly surrender. However, they were all Celestial King's trusted aides and right-hand men. Even if they were afraid of death, they still wanted to preserve their lives and power. However, they could not do such a humiliating and shameless thing. Of course, many of the generals were muttering in their hearts. As long as Feng Yi said something, they would definitely surrender without hesitation. Unfortunately, God King Fengyi was a smart person. He knew that no matter what, Kenshin would not let him go. Because of his special identity. He observed their expressions and saw that although the generals were silent on the surface, their determination was wavering. Thus, he hurriedly assumed a dignified posture and spoke righteously. Everyone, these bastards from the Domain Lords Alliance have long since harbored the intention to rebel. They are despicable traitors and traitors who are destined to be pinned on the pillar of shame. As for us, we are Celestial King's trusted aides. It was the Celestial King who valued and nurtured us that made us who we are. Even if we have to pay with our lives, we cannot retreat or be afraid. We must avenge the Celestial King and fight Kenshin to the end. Chapter 43-35. God King Feng Yi's words had some effect. At least half of the generals were incited by him and were determined to fight to the death with the Kenshin. But the other half of the generals, after careful consideration, chose to compromise and surrender. I'm sorry, I want to live, I can't die. A deity general stood out in shame and explained to God King Feng Yi and the rest. He then said to Ji Tianxing, Lord Kenshin, I've realized my mistake and will turn over a new leaf. Please accept my loyalty. He bowed to Ji Tianxing as he spoke, and then he turned around and walked towards the members of the Domain Lords Alliance. At this moment, the left side of the hall was filled with people from the Domain Lords Alliance and they were all loyal to Ji Tianxing. The members of the Domain Lords Alliance cast looks of disdain at this divine general who had deserted and betrayed them. They thought that since they were going to rebel against the Celestial King, it was natural for them to pledge their loyalty to the Kenshin. But this deity general was a direct descendant of the Celestial King. He was actually afraid of death and in order to live he chose to surrender without caring about his dignity. Despicable and shameless. A deity general was the first to surrender, and he set an example for the rest of the generals. Hence, one by one, the generals and experts left God King Feng Yi's team and bowed to Ji Tianxing to show their loyalty and walked to the left side of the hall. The situation was constantly changing. There were more and more experts pledging their loyalty to Ji Tianxing, and those who decided to follow God King Feng Yi and resist stubbornly grew fewer and fewer. Another half an hour passed and the situation finally stabilized. As of now, there were already 19 generals and experts who had betrayed the Celestial King and pledged their loyalty to Ji Tianxing. On the left side of the hall there were close to 80 experts. And on the right side of the hall, there were only about 20 people who were led by God King Feng Yi. Seeing that the crowd was successfully divided, Ji Tianxing didn't waste any more time and continued with the next step of the plan. Everyone should know that divine king powerhouses that swear fealty to this seat all need to swear an oath of surrender. But now is not the right time to make an oath. After I take control of Tiandu, I will let everyone make up for this ceremony. Now everyone needs to present a proof of allegiance to prove the sincerity of your loyalty. At this point, Ji Tianxing coldly smiled at Feng Yi's group and said in a low voice, "All of you must work together and kill these stubborn fools with me. This is not only a test of your sincerity, but also an opportunity to make a contribution. I hope that everyone will grasp this opportunity well." Everyone knew that in order to gain Kenshin's favor, one had to perform brilliantly and make great contributions. The 80 experts didn't expect that before they could even swear to surrender, the opportunity to perform a meritorious deed would come. With so many of them, wouldn't it be easy to surround and kill the 20 people led by Divine King Feng Yi? After making up their minds, everyone took out their Kenshin weapons and spread out to form an encirclement, surrounding God King Feng Yi and the others. Just a moment ago, over 100 divine kings were still united against a common enemy and were still brothers and comrades. But now they were actually going to face each other with their weapons. How laughable and ironic this scene was. God King Feng Yi was so angry that his face turned pale. His eyes were burning with rage as he roared at the top of his lungs, "You bunch of shameless B***stars. You actually betrayed us and became traitors. You even want to deal with your former comrades and comrades. Where is your conscience?" Many of the God King's expressions became rather unnatural when they heard this question. They seemed rather ashamed. But they didn't retreat. They continued to shrink the encirclement as they closed in on God King Feng Yi and the others. "Alright, it's time for everything to end. God King Feng Yi, all of you are so loyal to Celestial King. Then you can die with him." Ji Tianxing clapped his hands and took out the Burial of Heaven sword. The battle was finally about to begin. With a command, he commanded the 80 experts to surround and attack. At the same time, he charged into the hall and waved his divine sword at God King Feng Yi and the forbidden military governor. Swish, 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 swish. Instantly, the meeting hall lit up with dazzling divine light as it was filled with countless saber lights and sword shadows. God knows how many divine art lights and shadows clashed, creating a deafening explosion in the hall. Countless divine light fragments splattered everywhere. A battle where the numbers were unequal and it was destined to be a one-sided slaughter unfolded. The loud rumbling sounds were incessant. The shockwaves that could obliterate heaven and earth shook the entire heavenly deity palace until it was on the verge of collapse. The thousands of forbidden military guards outside the heavenly deity palace knew that there was a slaughter going on in the hall. They were extremely worried and anxious. But they were temporarily unable to enter the meeting hall and could only be anxious. The slaughter going on in the room was destined to not last for too long. Furthermore, Ji Tianxing's side had 4 times the number of people compared to the other party. Just him alone could kill God King Feng Yi and the others. 100 breaths later, the slaughter finally ended. God King Feng Yi died under the Burial of Heaven sword. Even his divine spark shattered into pieces. The 20 generals and powerhouses under his command were also dismembered by everyone's frenzied swords, turning to dust. The aftermath of the slaughter went so far as to destroy the entire heavenly deity palace, collapsing into ruins. At this time, those thousands of forbidden military guards finally rushed in. But when they saw the scene before their eyes clearly, they were stunned on the spot, not knowing what they should do. Ji Tianxing did not talk nonsense either, using the Burial of Heaven sword to point at those thousands of forbidden military guards. The 80 divine king powerhouses immediately understood and hurriedly brandished their sabers and brandished the Kenshin soldiers, unleashing a massacre on those forbidden military guards. This intense chase and battle lasted for another 15 minutes before it ended. This way, the heavenly deity palace's resistance forces were all eliminated. Ji Tianxing was not in a hurry to remove the chaos primordial bell. Instead, he stood above the ruins and fired out a stretch of blazing white divine light with a wave of his hand. Swoosh! The white divine light condensed to form an enormous screen. On it, close to 1,000 words appeared in a voluminous manner. Once they saw the words on the blazing white light screen, the 80 divine king powerhouses' pupils constricted, and a feeling of shock and helplessness arose in their hearts. In the past they had only heard of how tyrannical, harsh and cruel the heavenly oath that Kenshin made was. Now that they saw it with their own eyes, they knew that the rumors were true. To be honest, everyone was against that oath of surrender from the bottom of their hearts. But now that things had come to this, they could not go back on their words at the last minute. They could only silently accept it. Soon, the voices of many domain lords and divine king powerhouses rang out above the ruins. Their expressions were pained and their voices were low and uneven. But Ji Tianxing stood in the sky and looked down at everyone, not worried at all that anyone could get away with it, pretending to read the oath of surrender. This was because every person who read the oath of surrender would be surrounded by divine light, and a wisp of Daoist rhyme would appear above their heads. After a full 15 minutes, the 80 powerhouses finished reading the oath of surrender one after another. Everyone was enveloped by Daoist rhyme and divine light as they stood expressionlessly on the spot. In the sky above heavenly capital, continuous muffled sounds of thunder also rang out. Clearly, the oath of heavenly Tao had been established, and from this moment on, they would be monitored and restricted by the heavenly Tao. Chapter 43-36. Ji Tianxing had successfully subdued 80 God King experts. The outcome was set. Even though there were more than 200 God Kings and tens of thousands of soldiers in Heaven Capital. However, the remaining 100 or so God Kings and 30,000 soldiers were nothing to worry about. These 80 God Kings who had pledged their allegiance were the mainstays of Celestial King's army. Each of them held great authority and controlled a force. After the heaven and earth anomaly caused by the heavenly oath ended, Ji Tianxing waved his hand and removed the primordial chaos bell. Swoosh! Above the ruins, the 80 God Kings saw the light again. They felt as though it had been a lifetime. Just a moment ago, they were still Celestial King's capable subordinates. They were still fighting amongst themselves. Now the era of Celestial King had ended. They had all pledged their allegiance to Kenshin. Fate was just so bizarre. Caught people off guard. Heavenly God Palace had turned into ruins. Tens of thousands of soldiers had gathered in the sky. There were more than 8,000 Imperial Guards. Among them there were more than 50 God Kings. There were also 30,000 soldiers. They were the subordinates of dozens of territorial lords. There were also disciples of dozens of forces. Among the 30,000 people there were more than 70 God Kings. Overall, 95% of the people in Heaven Capital were present. Only a dozen God Kings and 2,000 soldiers were left guarding the entrance of Heaven Capital. They could not be present for the time being. During this period of time, the 30,000 soldiers heard that Heavenly God Palace had been sealed by a God Bell. Everyone expected the situation to change. They all rushed to Heavenly God Palace and surrounded the primordial chaos bell. They were not sure what had happened inside the God Bell. They thought that the Territorial Lords Alliance and God King Feng Yi had a conflict and war. Therefore, the 30,000 people from the Territorial Lords Alliance and the thousands of Imperial Guards were divided into two groups. They were on guard against each other. However, when the God Bell was lifted, dozens of powerhouses appeared. The scene in front of them stunned everyone. God King Feng Yi had disappeared. The generals under Celestial King's command and the dozens of experts from the Territorial Lords Alliance did not fight. They stood together obediently. A total of 80 divine king powerhouses all followed behind an unfamiliar white-robed youth. That white-robed youth was handsome and had an extraordinary temperament. His entire body emitted an invisible divine pressure. Compared to the Celestial King, he had more of the aura of a supreme master. He was also more sacred and dignified, as if he represented the heavens and the earth. This unfamiliar scene stunned everyone. Over 30,000 people were stunned. Their gazes all gathered on the white-robed young man as the same question popped up in their minds. Who is he? Why were the generals under the direct command of the Celestial King and the experts of the Domain Masters Alliance at peace and even respectfully following him? Silence reigned in the field. Suddenly, a divine king powerhouse reacted. His expression changed drastically, becoming extremely agitated. His eyes widened in horror as he pointed at Ji Tianxing in disbelief and exclaimed, "Kenshin! He's a Kenshin!" Under the silence, this person's exclamation was particularly ear-piercing, and everyone heard it clearly. Instantly, more than 30,000 people were filled with shock and disbelief. After a brief silence, deafening exclamations and discussions broke out. Countless people subconsciously retreated and some even turned to flee. There was no other way. Kenshin's reputation was too great and had long been deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been on guard against the arrival of Kenshin since half a year ago. Their fear of Kenshin had long been engraved into their bones. They had imagined many times how the sword god would attack Tiandu and how he would appear on stage. But no one could have imagined that the first time they would see Kenshin would be under such circumstances and in such a manner. This was too horrifying and too absurd. For a moment the scene was a little chaotic. Over 30,000 people were about to flee in panic. Ji Tianxing looked at the soldiers with an indifferent expression, but he did not stop them. Because he was very clear that the situation had been decided. No matter what the 30,000 people did, it would be futile. Most people would obediently pledge their allegiance after calming down. After all, their leaders had already pledged their allegiance. Would they, as soldiers, dare to resist? Even if there were some people who were not afraid of death and really stubbornly resisted to the end, then they would be killed. As expected, the 80 God King powerhouses who had just pledged their allegiance also thought of this. Seeing their subordinates fleeing in all directions in a mess, their expressions were ugly, and they were incomparably worried. In order to protect the lives of their subordinates, they had no choice but to step forward and order with a dignified expression, "All of you get back here. What are you running for? Quickly come and pay respects to Lord Kenshin. A bunch of useless good-for-nothings. Did my usual admonishments go in one ear and out the other? You don't have any determination at all. If you can't even withstand this little storm and twists, do you think I still expect you to bathe in blood on the battlefield and kill the enemy?" Many generals and domain lords berated their subordinates, telling them to get back into formation and pay respects to Ji Tianxing. And the last general to speak attracted the attention of countless people with one sentence, and the corners of their mouths could not help but twitch. "You call this a little storm and twists? This is called a dramatic change in the world, okay? Don't talk about those soldiers who couldn't withstand it. Weren't we also stunned before?" This thought flashed through the minds of many powerhouses, and they could not help but ridicule that general. The chaos lasted for a few breaths before it gradually calmed down. More than 30,000 soldiers obeyed the order and returned. Their emotions gradually calmed down, and they hurriedly got into formation and bowed to Ji Tianxing in unison. Azure Mountain Region's subordinates pay respects to Lord Kenshin. Clear Sea Region's subordinates pay respects to Lord Kenshin. Annihilation Sect's disciples pay respects to Lord Kenshin. The soldiers and disciples of dozens of regions, sects and clans all bowed and paid their respects. Even the 8,000+ Imperial Guards bowed and paid their respects to him obediently. Without a doubt, none of the force's disciples were stupid enough to continue fleeing or resisting. After more than 30,000 soldiers bowed and paid their respects, Ji Tianxing signaled for the soldiers to leave. Then he issued orders to the many powerhouses behind him and assigned tasks to everyone. Some were responsible for rebuilding the Heavenly God Palace, and some were responsible for taking over the defense of the Heavenly Capital's entrance. In addition, Ji Tianxing also sent out a few forces to patrol and search the entire Heavenly Capital for those who had escaped the net. Ji Tianxing only had one request for those who had escaped the net. They either had to submit and pledge their allegiance or they would be killed on the spot. Those generals and powerhouses who had received the order and were tasked with the task all bowed to show that they had obeyed, and then led their subordinates to carry out the task. There were still more than 40 forces who had not been assigned tasks. Ji Tianxing asked them to return to their respective stations to rest and wait for orders. Chapter 43-37. Hundreds of regions in the Firmament mainland had been conquered by the Rebel Alliance long ago. Now Ji Tianxing had conquered Tiandu with his own strength and controlled the overall situation. Up to now, the entire firmament mainland had changed hands and was completely occupied by Ji Tianxing. However, Ji Tianxing was not in a hurry to announce the news. He first rested in Heaven Capital and waited for 3 days. After 3 days, everything in Heaven Capital returned to normal. The reconstruction of Heaven God Palace was completed and the defense force was still under the control of the Imperial Guards. However, the governor and deputy governor of the Imperial Guards and dozens of captains were forced to swear allegiance. In this way, it could ensure that the 10,000 Imperial Guards were completely loyal to Ji Tianxing and would not cause any trouble. In addition, more than 60 region masters and dozens of forces had also completed the reorganization and cleaning. Ji Tianxing opened the internal space of the primordial bell of chaos and let the disciples of the four forces, including the Fantasy Sun sect, appear. He also ordered the opening of the entrance of Heaven Capital and summoned the 1,000 disciples of the Shifeng Pavilion. The leaders of the 5 forces and 5,000 disciples appeared in Heaven Capital. After figuring out their situation and understanding what had happened, everyone was stunned and praised Kenshin for his power. Ji Tianxing gathered more than 100 God King experts and the leaders of the 5 forces. They held a meeting in the conference hall. At this meeting, he announced to the public that he had completely controlled the firmament mainland. In addition, the Rebel Alliance would take charge and govern the firmament mainland from now on. The Imperial Guards and the Region Masters would be controlled by the Rebel Alliance. Normally, the affairs of the firmament mainland would be handled by the Region Masters at their discretion. When something important happened, it would be reported to the Rebel Alliance. When something important happened in the firmament mainland, it would be discussed and decided by the 5 forces of the Rebel Alliance. If they still could not make up their minds, it would be reported to him and he would make the decision. Among the 5 forces of the Rebel Alliance, the Fantasy Sun sect was the leader and the leader of the Fantasy Sun sect was in charge. In this way, the new power structure of the firmament mainland was formed. The first mission that Ji Tianxing gave to each of the domain leaders was to abolish the slavery system as soon as possible and restore freedom to the common people. The various domain masters and forces were finally relieved. After saluting Ji Tianxing, they took their leave and left Tiandu with their soldiers and returned to their respective territories. Of course, their domain chiefs' mansions were sealed. If he wanted to unlock the seal, he would need the special token that Ji Tianxing had given him. With the departure of the territorial lords and experts, the news of Kenshin's conquest of the firmament continent spread to every corner of the firmament continent. He believed that in just a few days, everyone would know about this news. After the leaders of the various territories and forces left, only the people of the Rebel Alliance and the direct subordinates of the Celestial King were left in the meeting hall. Among these 20 over God King experts, the Imperial Guard's deputy governor was the leader. The other 20 or so generals were also divine generals who controlled a region and commanded 100,000 soldiers. Ji Tianxing did not change their positions. Instead, he transferred them to the Rebel Alliance. From now on, the Rebel Alliance needed to help these divine generals to gather 100,000 elite soldiers to guard and patrol the firmament mainland in case of any emergency. Under normal circumstances, these 20 or so divine generals and 2 million elite soldiers were responsible for guarding the 4 directions and maintaining the stability of the firmament mainland. Under special circumstances, they would be the vanguard to kill the enemy and quell the rebellion. The number of the Imperial Guard would remain at 10,000. Their main task was to guard Tiandu. Like the 20 or so divine generals, they were under the direct jurisdiction of the Rebel Alliance and were under the command of the Illusory Sun Sect Master. Ji Tianxing set the framework of the power system in short words. Next, there were many details to be perfected. This was what the 5 forces and the divine generals of the Rebel Alliance needed to worry about. All in all, Ji Tianxing abolished the cumbersome rules left by the Celestial King and abandoned the once complicated bureaucratic system. The system he set up was very simple and clear. The Lord of 100 territories had the right to self-rule. The 24 divine generals and elite soldiers were responsible for guarding and patrolling the world and maintaining stability. The Imperial Guard guarded Tiandu and carried out special tasks at critical moments. These 3 systems were under the jurisdiction and control of the Rebel Alliance. In this way, when the personnel of each level handled affairs, it became simple and clear and could greatly improve efficiency. Moreover, the clear division of the power system also eliminated the danger of cliques and cliques to a greater extent. However, the rebel alliance had a very high status and had unparalleled control and power. Especially the illusory Sun sect master who almost had the same power as Ji Tianxing. This was a measure that no ruler dared to implement. Just like the celestial king, he would never give power to some people under his command. He could only think of ways to distribute power as much as possible and let the various forces under his command restrain each other. Only Ji Tianxing had the courage to do so. After all, he had the super strong trump card and trump card of the heavenly oath. He did not have to worry about the loyalty of the five forces. In just 5 days, the news that Kenshin had completely conquered the firmament mainland spread across the continent. This shocking news spread like wildfire across the continent, and it only took a few days for everyone to know about it. Therefore, the entire firmament mainland was in an uproar. Hundreds of millions of people cheered for Kenshin's brilliance. He had created another miracle. No wonder he was the embodiment of justice, the son of heavenly axiom. Because with the spread of this amazing news, the news of how Kenshin conquered Tiandu was also widely spread. It was hailed as a miracle and a legend by hundreds of millions of people. All along, the entire continent had been paying attention to when Kenshin would attack Tiandu. As long as Kenshin conquered Tiandu, they would have complete control of the firmament mainland. However, Kenshin only had 5 forces under his command. They could only gather 5,000 elite masters. It was a fool's dream to attack Tiandu, which was guarded by the celestial king and guarded by 50,000 soldiers with such a small number of people. But now the result was out. Kenshin did not use 5,000 elite masters at all. He sneaked into Tiandu alone. Through a series of schemes, he killed the celestial king and subdued all the experts. This was equivalent to Kenshin conquering Tiandu alone. Even if he led 5,000 elite masters to conquer Tiandu in half a month, it would be an incredible miracle. What's more, he accomplished this feat alone. This was simply unbelievable. It was more absurd than listening to a heavenly book. But this was the truth. No matter how horrifying and shocking it was, they had to believe it. Therefore, in the eyes of hundreds of millions of people, this was a miracle. It was a miracle. Only the sword god, the peerless and peerless supremacy of the past and present, possessed such strength and means. Kenshin conquering Tiandu alone would become the first legend of the heavenly realm. It would be passed down through the ages. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 43-38. As time went by, the story of Kenshin conquering Heaven Capital alone was still widely spread in the firmament mainland. More and more commoners found out about this miracle. They all worshipped the sword god like a god and worshipped him to the extreme. As the territorial leaders returned to their respective territories and took control of the territorial leaders' mansion again, they called back their former subordinates and restored order in their respective territories. Those former subordinates were driven away by the rebel alliance. Without Kenshin's order, they were not allowed to return to the territorial leaders' mansion, nor were they allowed to be loyal to the territorial leaders. Now that the territorial leaders had pledged their allegiance to Kenshin, they called back their former subordinates with Kenshin's consent. Naturally, there was no problem. When the order in their respective territories was restored, the territorial leaders did not dare to delay and immediately began to carry out the tasks assigned by Kenshin. They abolished slavery as quickly as possible and issued various proclamations and orders to restore the freedom of all the people. Many territorial leaders thought they were clever. In order to cater to Kenshin's idea of saving the people, they restored the freedom of the people and gave some compensation to the slaves as a form of comfort. This was effective and won the approval of countless people and slaves. They were pleasantly surprised and regained a new life. Of course, the territorial leaders had enslaved them for many years. Even if they were given benefits, they would not be grateful to the territorial leaders and nobles. The person they were most grateful to and admired the most was Kenshin. Slavery was abolished in hundreds of territories in the firmament mainland. The people gradually regained their freedom and a new life. The entire mainland was in a state of carnival. People sang and danced everywhere, sparing no effort to promote and praise Kenshin. In each city, the people rushed into the shrines that they once worshipped and smashed the statues of the Nebula God Emperor and the Celestial King into the dust. Then the tycoons led the people to rebuild the shrines and erect the statues of Kenshin. After Kenshin conquered the firmament mainland, they would not enslave the people nor force them to worship and worship. However, the people were grateful and built shrines and statues spontaneously, worshipping sincerely from the bottom of their hearts. When the shrines in each city were built, countless people went to worship them spontaneously, burning incense all day long. Because there were too many people worshipping and thanking Kenshin, there was a long line in each of the shrines. In order to maintain order as well as to prevent chaos and innocent casualties, countless city lords had no choice but to set some rules. For example, they sent elite soldiers to guard the shrines and maintain order. Only 20,000 people were allowed to enter the shrines to worship each day. Latecomers had to register and wait. After these rules were set, the shrine's registration book was 1 or 2 months later. After all, each city had more than 1 million people and the bigger cities had millions of people. However, the people did not oppose the rules set by the territorial leaders. Because everyone knew that this was the only way to keep the temple quiet and dignified, so that it wouldn't be chaotic and cause trouble. Moreover, everyone was doing it voluntarily. The longer they waited in line, the more sincere they seemed. Other than restoring the freedom of the people, the various domain leaders had many other things to deal with. After all, Kenshin was the new ruler of the firmament mainland. The rules, laws, and bad habits left behind by the Celestial King needed to be abolished, modified, and perfected. In the next 1 or 2 years, the territorial leaders would be busy. However, they followed Kenshin's orders and carried out the government orders. They would not complain even if they were tired. Firstly, they had all sworn to the heavenly Tao that they would not dare to criticize Kenshin. Secondly, they did not reject Kenshin's rule of the firmament mainland. They were happy to accept this new era. Because, in the past 2 years, there had been a lot of news from the boundless heaven mainland and the reincarnation island. The news showed that ever since the sword god took control of the continent, everyone was free and the continent was peaceful and stable. Compared to before, the lives of the common people were much more blissful. The relationship between the nobles and the people had also become more harmonious. Of course, the cultivation level of the boundless heaven mainland and the reincarnation island had also improved. Many geniuses and elites had emerged. In general, Kenshin had brought great changes to the two mainlands and ushered in a prosperous era of freedom. The territorial leaders and rulers of the firmament mainland also wanted to experience it. They wanted to see if the firmament mainland would be as free and peaceful as before. Unknowingly, a month had passed. After the initial shock and turmoil, the firmament mainland gradually calmed down. A series of new government orders were implemented. The entire mainland was stabilized. It was full of freedom, peace, and tranquility. After the miracle created by Kenshin spread throughout the firmament mainland, it began to spread to other mainlands. Especially the Qianquan mainland and the chaotic mainland. They had been in a state of fear, worried that Kenshin would attack. In the past few months, they knew that Kenshin was in the firmament mainland. They used all kinds of methods and forces to pay close attention to the movements of the firmament mainland. When the rulers of the two mainlands knew that Kenshin had conquered Heaven Capital and controlled the firmament mainland, they were shocked and anxious. They combined the details of Kenshin's conquest of the boundless Heaven mainland and the reincarnation island after he returned to the God realm and came to a conclusion. When Kenshin conquered the boundless Heaven mainland, the overall process was smooth. However, the process was long and steady. When it came to subduing the reincarnation island, it was swift and decisive. When conquering the firmament mainland, it was even more risky. He took risks alone and quickly conquered Heaven Capital in an extremely thrilling and bizarre way. It could be seen that Kenshin's strength was still growing and improving rapidly in the past few years. As early as when Kenshin conquered the boundless Heaven mainland, there were rumors that Kenshin had surpassed the peak Divine King realm and was close to the God Emperor realm. After conquering the firmament mainland, there were rumors that he was on par with the 5 God Emperors. If it was before, the rulers of the Qianquan mainland and the chaotic mainland would not believe these rumors. But now the truth was in front of them. They had to believe it. They became more and more panicked and worried. When Kenshin attacked their territories in the future, how could they resist? Except for the 5 God Emperors who could be Kenshin's opponent. Calculating the time, it had been a month since Kenshin conquered the firmament mainland. Now the situation of the firmament mainland had changed. The turmoil had ended and peace was gradually restored. Since the situation had stabilized with Kenshin's style of doing things, there had been no news of him for half a month. Then it was very likely that he had handed over the power to the Rebel Alliance and had quietly left for other mainlands. Speculating this result, The rulers of the chaotic mainland and the Qianquan mainland panicked. Chapter 43-39. In fact, the guesses of the rulers of the two continents were not wrong. Ji Tianxing certainly knew that in the process of conquering the firmament continent, the people of the Qianquan continent and the chaotic continent must have been paying attention to his movements. The news of him conquering heaven capital alone and conquering the entire firmament continent must have spread throughout the firmament continent and be known by the people of the other continents. Especially the Qianquan continent and the chaotic continent, they had been on guard against him. After receiving the news, the rulers of the two continents would definitely be on high alert and fully prepared to fight. Of course, from the map of the God realm, the firmament continent was in the southwest, the chaotic continent was in the southeast, and the Qianquan continent was in the northeast. The closest place to the firmament continent was the chaotic continent in the southeast. It was obvious that Kenshin's next target would be the chaotic continent. Therefore, the rulers of the chaotic continent were the most nervous and anxious. And the rulers of the Qianquan continent could not be at ease. They were still worried and fearful. Kenshin's whereabouts had always been secretive. Who could guarantee that he would not take an unconventional approach and attack the Qianquan continent by surprise? Wasn't it the most common strategy to do the opposite? On the other hand, Ji Tianxing didn't intend to do the opposite. His next target was, of course, the chaotic continent. Therefore, there were only two choices in front of him. Either stall for time, wait for a few months or a year, when the rulers of the chaotic continent let down their guard, then attack the chaotic continent. Or leave the firmament continent in advance when no one was paying attention and rush to the chaotic continent at the fastest speed. It would be best if he could reach the chaotic continent before the rulers of the chaotic continent received the news, then he would have a chance to take action. However, Ji Tianxing did not want to waste time waiting for a few months or a year. Therefore, he chose the latter. After the situation in the firmament continent calmed down, he quietly left. He rode the god-slaying battleship and rushed to the east at an incredible speed, straight to the chaotic continent. The reason why he was in such a hurry and moved so quickly was that he wanted to catch the chaotic continent off guard. Secondly, the chaotic continent was the place where he took root and developed. There were his old subordinates and former allies there. He couldn't wait to return to the primal chaos continent to find his former subordinates and allies. Times had changed. He really wanted to see how the experts and subordinates who had followed him back then were doing now. How many people are still alive? How many people were still loyal to him, waiting for his return? Or, how many people had forgotten their original vows and promises, choosing to forget and betray? To be honest, Ji Tianxing had never felt apprehensive or fearful when facing God Emperor experts. But now, on the way to the primal chaos mainland, he actually felt a little apprehensive. 20 days ago, the rulers of the chaotic continent received the news that Kenshin had successfully conquered the firmament continent and stabilized the situation. In just a few days, the rulers gathered a large number of elite soldiers and began to prepare for war. Not only did they have to gather a large number of troops to guard the center of their power, but they also had to carry out all kinds of plans and set up countless lines of defense and formations in case of emergencies. In fact, the news they received was 10 days later than the actual situation. In other words, it had already been a month since Kenshin had conquered the firmament continent. After Ji Tianxing stabilized the situation in the firmament continent, he rewarded the 5 forces of the rebel alliance according to their contributions. After that, he stayed in the firmament continent for half a month. After arranging all the follow-up matters, he left the firmament continent quietly. As for the date of his departure, only the leaders of the 5 forces knew about it. Under normal circumstances, it would take 2 months to cross the endless sky sea from the firmament continent to the chaotic continent. But Bai Long drove the god-slaying battleship at an extremely fast speed. It would only take 20 days to arrive. At this time, the god-slaying battleship was flying above the endless sky sea, cutting through the vast sea of clouds like lightning. The battleship was about 5 days away from the west coast of the chaotic continent. Bai Long stayed alone in the cockpit of the battleship, concentrating on driving the battleship and monitoring the surrounding movements. Ji Tianxing, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, Yank and the others were all cultivating in the distorted time and space of the Jiutianzhu Tower. This batch of people who followed Ji Tianxing the earliest could all stay in the distorted time and space. Nangong Ao, Nangong Ni Huang, Yuchi Pa and the others who followed Ji Tianxing later, a total of 15 followers, could only stay in the battleship and cultivate in their respective secret rooms. This time Ji Tianxing had conquered the firmament continent. It was too thrilling and bizarre. It was completely his personal show, which could be called a heaven-defying performance. So much so that his subordinates did not contribute much, nor did they experience a great battle before it was announced that it was over. Even so, many of his followers had participated in the spying and assassination missions in the early stages. Ji Tianxing still gave them the rewards they deserved. When the situation in the firmament continent was stabilized, everyone returned to the battleship and began to cultivate in seclusion. These followers did not know about the magical effects of the Jutianshu Tower and the distorted time and space. But Yun Yao, Ji Ku and the others were clear about it. They saw that Nangong Nihuang was the only woman among the 15 followers. Moreover, they also knew about Nangong Nihuang's background and experience. The two of them persuaded Ji Tianxing that he could ignore the other 14 followers, but he should try his best to summon Nangong Nihuang into the distorted time and space. This would be more helpful for Nangong Nihuang's cultivation. Yun Yao and Ji Ku said it more tactfully, using the reason that Nangong Nihuang was a woman and was very loyal to Ji Tianxing, so she could be completely trusted. But Ji Tianxing could still tell that the two of them already knew about Nangong Nihuang's feelings. They knew that Nangong Nihuang's heart had not changed for 1,000 years. Now, in order to follow the person she loved, she would rather leave her home and homeland and follow him to wander the world and conquer the world. This infatuation and determination was enough to move Yun Yao and Ji Ku and make them acknowledge her. Obviously, the two of them planned to accept Nangong Nihuang as their third sister. Although their actual age was 2,000 years younger than Nangong Nihuang, this kind of thing was not based on age. It was important to pay attention to first come, first served. Ji Tianxing was both helpless and amused. Naturally, he could not agree to Yun Yao and Ji Ku. He could only tell them not to set a precedent. Otherwise, there were many beautiful women in the heavenly realm and the dragon realm who were infatuated with him. Should he accept them one by one? Besides, after he conquered the entire heavenly realm, he would have to fight the 5 god emperors to settle his grudges. He still did not have enough confidence to compete with the 5 god emperors. If he kept Nangong Nihuang by his side at this time, wouldn't he be harming her? Hearing his words, Yun Yao could not help but roll her eyes at him and said, "I thought you were cold and arrogant back then and did not get close to women. I didn't expect you to be so affectionate and attract so many women." Chapter 4340. Ji Tianxing felt wronged by Yun Yao's words. Kenshin was indeed very cold and arrogant back then. He really didn't get close to women. Otherwise, he and Mingyue, who was now Ji Ku, would have been a couple long ago. Why wait until this era? Yun Yao didn't really blame him. She also understood his nature. He was just teasing him. Ji Ku was more direct. She said disapprovingly, "Anyway, Miss Nangong is already following you. She will definitely advance and retreat with you in the future. Why don't you take her in before the final battle? You can also fulfill her wish and not let her have any regrets." This time it was Ji Tianxing's turn to roll his eyes. He couldn't help but stretch out his finger and flick Ji Ku's forehead. He pretended to be angry and said, "What nonsense are you talking about? What do you take me for?" Ji Ku glared at him and pouted, feeling wronged. He was about to retort. Yun Yao waved her hand and smiled. "Tianxing, Miss Nangong's feelings for you have been tested by thousands of years. Her attitude is so firm. She didn't hesitate to give up her family and homeland to follow you. Perhaps there are many women in this world who have been infatuated with Kenshin before, but which woman can go to this extent? Cuckoo and I have experienced similar situations before. We can understand that kind of feeling. You should think about it carefully before making a decision." Obviously, if Ji Ku quarreled with Ji Tianxing, it would be as Ji Tianxing wished. The topic would be diverted. Fortunately, Yun Yao interrupted them in time and brought the topic back to normal. This forced Ji Tianxing to answer directly. He thought for a moment and nodded. "All right, let's talk about this after I take down the chaotic mainland." Yun Yao and Ji Ku didn't force him to make a decision immediately. They were satisfied with his answer. This matter was over. Then the three of them separated and continued to cultivate in seclusion. After the god-slaying battleship traveled continuously for 20 days. On the morning of the 21st day, the battleship successfully reached the west coast of the Primal Chaos continent. The god-slaying battleship flew above the Primal Chaos continent, passing through the vast sea of clouds. The god-slaying battleship slowed down slightly, paying more attention to concealment and concealment. Ji Tianxing was no stranger to the primal chaos mainland. Back then he had taken root here and established a force on this continent, absorbing countless followers and troops. He had once traveled to over 100 regions on the primal chaos land, exploring every single mystic realm and dangerous forbidden ground. Even though thousands of years had passed, the terrain and structure of the primal chaos continent had changed slightly. However, as long as the general situation remained the same, he still knew it like the back of his hand. He knew the geography of the primal chaos continent, the ancient clans and the top sects. The only thing he wasn't clear about was the current situation in the 100 territories and where the center of power was located. Originally, he should have done what he did in the past and sent out 15 followers to scout for information in various regions. But he didn't intend to do so this time. He did not send out his followers. Instead, he had by long drive the battleship to the Xianxia domain. The Xianxia domain was in the northwest of the primal chaos continent. It was Kenshin's territory back then. At that time, the 5 continents of the god world had not been ruled by the 5 god emperors. All the regions on the various continents were controlled by the ancient clans and domain lords. Kenshin had occupied the Xianxia domain back then and was the Xianxia domain lord. However, his reputation was resounding, his strength was extremely strong and the forces under him were also top-notch. All the ancient clans on the primal chaos continent had been challenged and defeated by him. Naturally, no one dared to suppress or control him. As a result, the few regions around the Xianxia domain had all submitted to him and treated him as their backer. For example, the Qianshan domain and the Tianquan domain. Back then, when Ji Tianxing was in the lower realm, he had discovered a shattered god star. There was a broken statue on it and it was God King Heavenly Eagle. And God King Heavenly Eagle was the domain lord of the Qianshan domain. He was famous for being aloof from worldly affairs and indifferent to fame and fortune. He was known as the idol king of Qianshan. In that era of mutual deceit and conflict of interests, God King Heavenly Eagle was able to obtain the title of idol king and was not bullied by many experts and forces. The main reason was, he was Kenshin's friend and his territory was close to the Kenshin's Tianshan domain. As for the Tianquan domain, it was the territory of the Yan clan, and also Yang's hometown and home. After Yang's father abdicated, Yang had been the domain lord for close to 200 years. Back then, the Yan clan and Kenshin had a very deep relationship. With Kenshin's guidance, they had prospered and flourished. It was also because of this that Yanku followed Ji Tianxing wholeheartedly after learning of his identity and never had any thoughts of betrayal. Yang was still thinking that one day he would be able to follow Kenshin back to the Tianquan domain. It would definitely be an extremely glorious thing. This time, Ji Tianxing returned to the primal chaos continent. The first thing he wanted to do was to go to the Tianshan domain to see his former residents and find his former subordinates. Then he would make a trip to the Thousand Mountains domain to understand the cause of God King Heavenly Eagle's death. He also wanted to visit the Yan clan's Tianquan domain. Other than Yang, the Yan clan had a deep foundation and had many God King experts. Ji Tianxing believed that as long as he gave the order, the Yan clan would definitely pledge their loyalty. The divine ship followed the western coastline of the primal chaos continent all the way to the Tianshan domain in the northwest. Along the way they passed by many regions. Ji Tianxing also saw the local customs of the various domains. Those familiar scenes, the cities, places of interest that he had seen and walked through before, evoked his memories. He recalled many past events. More than 1,000 years ago, his name spread throughout the god world and deterred the primal chaos continent. No one dared to oppose him. He oversaw the Tianshan domain, and under his command were the 10 directions god kings, the 8 divine generals, the dominator of the 6 paths, 2 protectors and 20,000 swordsmen. The leaders of several ancient clans and top factions were close friends with him. Countless factions and domain lords treated him with great respect and courtesy. Back then he was the most powerful and prestigious expert in the primal chaos continent. Unfortunately, in the battle of the gods in outer space his disciple White Dragon and Hongyan Mingyue all died. The 2 great protectors had died in battle for the sake of helping him, completely falling. More than half of the 10 directions god kings, the 8 divine generals and the dominator of the 6 paths were killed, and the survivors were nowhere to be found. As for the 20,000 swordsmen, more than 80% died, and the survivors were scattered everywhere, never to be heard from again. In addition, many of his good friends and experts who had followed him and helped him fight against strong enemies also died in the battle. In that battle, the 5 god emperors led 100,000 gods to besiege him, and he led 50,000 soldiers to fight a bloody battle. 150,000 gods fought fiercely in the void, causing the void to tremble and blood to dye 1,000,000 miles. Thinking back to that incomparably tragic scene, Ji Tianxing's monstrous anger and hatred once again surged. Now his strength had increased to 58 times that of an ordinary peak god king. He could not wait to take control of the god world as soon as possible and seek revenge on the 5 god emperors. Chapter 43-41. 8 days later, the god-slaying battleship arrived at the heavenly mountain region. This region was vast and most of it was plains. There were also many huge mountain ranges that ran from north to south. More than 10 empires and close to 100 divine nations were located in the heavenly mountain region. They ruled close to 100 billion people. The mountains and rivers were beautiful and the scenery was beautiful. Many mountains, lakes and forests were still the same as before. However, when Ji Tianxing returned to his cave abode and saw the scene before him, his face turned gloomy. Disappointment and melancholy filled his face. The famous Heavenly Sword Mountain was beneath his feet. It was a majestic mountain range that ran from north to south. It was also one of the spirit veins in the heavenly mountain region. It was rich in divine power and resources. The Heavenly Sword Mountain was in the middle of the mountain range. It was the most majestic peak. Back then, Kenshin's cave abode was at the peak of this mountain. It was located in a grotto heaven. It was once known as the #1 Sword Dao Holy Land in the world. It was really crowded. There was an endless stream of people who came to visit and worship. However, at this moment, Ji Tianxing was not standing on a towering mountain that was tens of thousands of feet tall. Instead, it was a small mountain that was only a few thousand feet tall. Its surface was covered with towering trees. It looked as ordinary as the surrounding mountains. There was nothing special about it. If one looked carefully and used their divine consciousness to search the inside of the mountain, they could even find some ancient bricks and broken tablets. It was obvious that the once towering Heavenly Sword Mountain had been destroyed and turned into a pile of yellow soil. The plaza, array, altar and statue at the peak of the mountain were also destroyed and buried deep in the ruins. After thousands of years, vegetation grew on the yellow soil ruins, forming a lush forest that covered all traces of the ruins. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing was very familiar with his cave abode. That was why he could confirm that this was the Heavenly Sword Mountain. If it were anyone else, they would not have thought that this inconspicuous small mountain was actually the #1 Sword Dao Holy Land from thousands of years ago. Since the Heavenly Sword Mountain was destroyed, the entrance to the grotto heaven was naturally destroyed as well. Ji Tianxing released his divine consciousness and used a special skill to check the surrounding sky. However, there was nothing unusual about the surrounding sky. There was no space. In other words, his cave abode and grotto heaven had been destroyed and no longer existed. Even though Ji Tianxing had expected this result, he was still shocked. However, after he personally came to Heavenly Sword Mountain and investigated the situation, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. The glory of the past no longer existed. Thousands of years had passed and the world had changed. This place used to be as crowded as a marketplace, but now it was deserted. Not even a few birds or beasts could be seen. Ji Tianxing stood in the sky and looked down at the Heavenly Sword Mountain ruins. He stood there quietly for a long time. The white dragon had already put away the god-slaying battleship and stood behind him silently. He looked at the desolate scene around him with a heavy heart. After all, this used to be his home. A quarter of an hour later, the wind in the sky became even stronger. The gale blew at their robes, making them flutter. Ji Tianxing ended his contemplation and recollections. With a calm expression, he said, "Forget it. It's useless to reminisce about the past. Let's first inquire about the news and see if any of those people are still alive." With that, he turned to leave with the white dragon. However, at this moment, countless beams of divine light suddenly lit up in the sky 100,000 miles away from the Heavenly Sword Mountain. Swish, 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 swish. Tens of thousands of 5-colored divine light streaked across the sky and quickly approached the Heavenly Sword Mountain. Ji Tianxing immediately sensed that something was wrong. He used his divine senses to cover the surrounding tens of thousands of miles and saw the situation clearly. It turned out that there were close to 30,000 Surgod experts. They were all wearing armor and holding swords. They were charging over with murderous intent. They formed a huge circle and quickly closed in, surrounding the heavenly sword mountain so tightly that not even a drop of water could escape. In front of the many divine monarchs, there were over 100 divine king experts. They were obviously commanders and generals of some sort. The sudden change gave the white dragon a shock. He immediately wanted to summon the god-slaying battleship and escape with his master. Ji Tianxing was still able to maintain his composure. He frowned and looked around. He sneered and said, "Interesting. These people from the Primal Chaos mainland have some brains and tricks up their sleeves." Without a doubt, in the Primal Chaos mainland, only the ruler of the Primal Chaos mainland, the overlord supported by the Prajna God Emperor, could mobilize and order 30,000 Sir God experts. In the past, when Ji Tianxing subdued the Boundless Heaven mainland, Reincarnation Island and Firmament mainland, he had sneaked into the mainland to investigate the situation and develop and strengthen his forces. The overlord of the mainland could only hide in the capital city and strengthen his defenses. He would wait for Ji Tianxing to attack before the final battle between the two sides. This was equivalent to giving the initiative to Ji Tianxing. Hence he had a lot of room to perform. However, what Ji Tianxing did not expect was that the ruler of the Primal Chaos mainland had such courage and wisdom. They had guessed that he would attack the Primal Chaos mainland. They had actually set up 30,000 soldiers around the ruins of the Heavenly Sword Mountain as an ambush. As such, he had just arrived at the Primal Chaos mainland and had yet to submit to any forces before he was surrounded by an army. This was undoubtedly extremely dangerous. It was also the best opportunity for the other party to kill him. In just a few breaths, the 30,000 soldiers had completed the encirclement and stopped 10,000 miles away from Ji Tianxing. The 30,000 soldiers clenched their swords tightly. The Kenshin soldiers stared at Ji Tianxing with murderous intent. They accumulated a vast amount of divine power in their bodies and were ready to attack at any time. Ji Tianxing's gaze swept across the crowd. Among the hundreds of God King experts, he locked onto a woman in a purple dress and a fiery red phoenix cape. That woman's strength was extremely high. She had already surpassed the peak God King level and possessed the aura of a God Emperor expert. Clearly, she was the leader of this army. More than 30 high-level God Kings and more than 60 mid-level God Kings treated her as their leader. She was 8 feet tall and had a well-proportioned and slender body. Her snow-white and clean face was adorned with exquisite facial features. She appeared especially elegant, gentle, and quick-witted. Her waist-long black hair was tied up by a white jade hairband and hung behind her back. She wore an exquisite divine crown with phoenix wings spread and dragons surrounding her. It made her look graceful and luxurious. From her appearance and temperament, this purple-dressed woman did not look like an awe-inspiring empress, nor was she an unparalleled supreme being who looked down on the world. She was more like an otherworldly hermit who did not care about worldly affairs. She was more like an otherworldly immortal. No matter who saw her, they would not feel disgust or alienation. They would naturally feel respect and intimacy. However, Ji Tianxing's gaze turned colder when it landed on her. He said in a mocking tone, "Xianxia, I haven't seen you in 1,000 years. When did you become so scheming? You actually guessed that I would arrive at the Primal Chaos mainland ahead of time. You even guessed that I would come to the Heavenly Sword Mountain. You have changed." Without a doubt, that otherworldly woman in a purple dress was the master of the Primal Chaos mainland, the Xianxia God Emperor. Of course, this was only the Xianxia God Emperor's avatar and not her true self. Chapter 43-42. Previously, Ji Tianxing had killed a few God Emperor's avatars when he was roaming the various star fields. But he had never seen Pan Rua's avatar. Ever since he returned to the God realm and planned to subdue the various continents, he had expected that there would be a day when he would face Pan Rua's avatar. Even though he had already destroyed a few God Emperor's avatars, reality had proven that his strength was extremely strong and was very close to the original body of the God Emperor. Logically speaking, Pan Rua God Emperor should not have sent an avatar to deal with him. This was equivalent to giving up on the avatar. But Ji Tianxing believed that Pan Rua would definitely not sit by and watch the Primal Chaos continent be subdued. Even if Pan Rua knew that the avatar was not his match, she would still return to the Primal Chaos continent and take charge of the situation, thinking of ways to deal with him. The scene in front of him was the best proof. At this moment, Pan Rua looked at Ji Tianxing with an indifferent expression and opened her mouth to speak. Long Tian, don't speak as if we are very familiar with each other. Ever since that incident back then, this emperor and you have completely broken off. You feel that this emperor has changed. That is only because this emperor is no longer young and inexperienced, no longer as foolish as before. When this emperor has greater strength and reached a whole new realm, I naturally have a whole new understanding and concept. Just like now, this emperor sees the reborn you, and there is not the slightest ripple in my heart. It is just like looking at an ant. Even though Pan-Ra God Emperor's expression was very indifferent, and her tone was also very cold, with a bit of contempt and disdain. But attentive people could hear that she still had a trace of hatred towards Ji Tianxing. That kind of hatred was somewhat special. It was not the kind of hatred that came from vengeance, but a kind of hatred that carried hidden bitterness. Whether it was Bai Long behind Ji Tianxing or the god generals and two marshals behind Pan-Ra, they all knew a bit about the past between Pan-Ra and Kenshin. So they were all well aware of why Pan-Ra treated Kenshin with such an attitude and tone. Because, more than 1,300 years ago, before Kenshin had become a peak divine king, not long after he came to the primal chaos continent, he had met Pan-Ra. At that time, Pan-Ra was one of the 10 great genius god kings of the primal chaos continent. She was the most elegant and transcendent one. Besides cultivating the divine Tao and exploring and comprehending the starry sky outside the realm, she seemed to have no other hobbies. She didn't care about her appearance, nor did she care about her reputation, nor did she have any interest in relationships between men and women. She was like a lotus flower that stood aloof from the world, fresh and elegant, causing others to only admire her from afar and not profane her. Such a peerless genius with such a unique temperament was naturally the object of admiration and respect of countless young men in the entire primal chaos continent. Countless young talents treated her as the purest goddess in their hearts. Until she met a peerless genius, Kenshin Ruanshan. During those 100 years, Kenshin was like the scorching sun rising from the east, dazzling and unstoppable. Countless young geniuses and seniors had successively been defeated by his sword, and this had established his invincible legend and reputation. Even the 20 or so ancient clans of the primal chaos continent had been visited by him one by one, and defeated one by one on the grounds of exchanging pointers. Ban Ruo originally didn't care about fame and glory, but Kenshin's rise was too shocking. He had revealed his edge and his reputation was too great. The 9 peerless geniuses who were equally famous as her had successively been defeated by Kenshin's sword. She was the only one who didn't exchange pointers with Kenshin. Kenshin's reputation became more and more famous. Countless busybodies in the world began to compare her with Kenshin, calling them the 2 peerless geniuses. Moreover, in the rumors and slanders that filled the sky, she and Kenshin were called a pair made in heaven, and were incomparably compatible. Only a peerless genius like Kenshin was worthy of having Ban Ra, and only a peerless goddess like Ban Ra was worthy of Kenshin. Kenshin challenged the 9 genius divine kings and defeated countless seniors and clan experts, but he didn't make a move against Ban Ra. This was because he had already fallen in love with Ban Ra. Ban Ra had always been secretive about her whereabouts, traveling everywhere and not meeting with Kenshin. This was also because she had feelings for Kenshin since a long time ago. Such rumors and slanders were widely spread in the primal chaos continent, and could be said to be known by everyone. So much so that these rumors and slanders even spread out of the primal chaos continent to other continents. The world originally thought that these rumors and slanders that damaged the reputation of Kenshin and Ban Ra would be cleared up and broken by them sooner or later. But no one would have thought that Kenshin was cold and aloof, and was infatuated with the cultivation of the divine way and the sword way. He turned a deaf ear to these rumors and didn't care at all. At the very beginning, Ban Ra could also treat it indifferently and ignore it. But as dozens of years passed, the rumors were gradually accepted by the world, as if it had become a conclusion. Kenshin still didn't express his position, and didn't have any intention of clearing it up. Thus, Ban Ra began to worry and her mind became anxious. She could no longer maintain a clean and refined attitude, and began to doubt, hesitate and guess in her heart. Kenshin had challenged almost all the experts and geniuses, but he didn't look for her and didn't have any intention of challenging her. Could it be that the rumors were true and Kenshin was interested in her? Moreover, the rumors in the outside world had been spreading for dozens of years. With Kenshin's aloof personality, if he didn't have any interest in her, he would have refuted and cleared it up long ago. Since Kenshin didn't express his position, could it be that he silently admitted that he really liked her? Just like that, Ban Ruo began to worry about her gains and losses. She was afraid that Kenshin would challenge her, but she also looked forward to meeting Kenshin in person. At that time she hadn't met Kenshin yet and didn't know what kind of person Kenshin was, let alone have any feelings for him. Perhaps she just couldn't stand being troubled by the rumors, and wanted to see Kenshin as soon as possible to get a definite answer. Or perhaps, being admired by an unparalleled prodigy like Kenshin made her heart waver, and gave birth to a trace of anticipation and joy. In short, after waiting for a few years she saw that Kenshin didn't show up, and was busy building up his forces in the heavenly mountain region, and couldn't help but show up. That was the first time she saw Kenshin. In all fairness, Kenshin's peerless talent and aptitude to become a peak divine king in a few hundred years already made her feel inferior. But when she saw that Kenshin, who was praised by the world, was indeed handsome, heroic and aloof, she couldn't help but feel her heart thump. At that moment she suddenly felt that there were other things in the world besides cultivation and the starry sky that were worth pursuing. In the entire God realm, looking at the billions of heroes in the 5 continents and 4 seas, only Kenshin could catch her eye and make her feel inferior. After she met Kenshin, the two of them looked at each other in the sky above Heavenly Sword Mountain for a long time, but neither of them spoke. It was Ban Ruo who calmed down her complicated emotions and pretended to be calm as she questioned, Kenshin, you challenged all the genius divine kings and senior legendary figures, but you didn't challenge me. Are you looking down on me and purposely ignoring me? Kenshin didn't answer her question and only said one sentence in an indifferent tone. You've already lost. Dream Island Novel, No Bullet Novel Reading Network. Chapter 43-43. Previously, Ji Tianxing had killed a few God Emperor's avatars when he was roaming the various star fields. But he had never seen Pan Ruo's avatar. Ever since he returned to the God realm and planned to subdue the various continents, he had expected that there would be a day when he would face Pan Ruo's avatar. Even though he had already destroyed a few God Emperor's avatars, reality proved that his strength was extremely strong, very close to the original bodies of the God Emperors. Logically speaking, Pan Ruo God Emperor should not have sent an avatar to deal with him. This was equivalent to giving up on the avatar. But Ji Tianxing believed that Pan Ruo would definitely not sit by and watch the primal chaos continent be subdued. Even if Pan Ruo knew that the avatar was not his match, she would still return to the primal chaos continent and take charge of the situation, thinking of ways to deal with him. The scene in front of him was the best proof. At this moment, Pan Ruo looked at Ji Tianxing with an indifferent expression and opened her mouth to speak. Long Tian, don't speak as if we are very familiar with each other. Ever since that incident back then, this emperor and you have completely broken off. You feel that this emperor has changed. That is only because this emperor is no longer young and inexperienced, no longer as foolish as before. When this emperor has greater strength and reached a whole new realm, naturally this emperor has a whole new understanding and concept. Just like now, this emperor sees the reborn you, there is not the slightest ripple in my heart. It is just like looking at an ant. Even though Pan Ruo God Emperor's expression was very indifferent, and her tone was also very cold, with a bit of contempt and disdain. But attentive people could hear that she still had a trace of hatred towards Ji Tianxing. That kind of hatred was somewhat special. It was not the kind of hatred of revenge, but a kind of hatred with hidden bitterness. Regardless of whether it was Bai Long behind Ji Tianxing or the god generals and 2 marshals behind Pan Ruo, they all knew a bit about the past between Pan Ruo and Kenshin. So they all knew why Pan Ruo had such an attitude and tone towards Kenshin. Because, more than 1,300 years ago, before Kenshin had become a peak god king, not long after coming to the primal chaos continent, he had met Pan Ruo. At that time, Pan Ruo was the most pure and elegant of the 10 god kings of the primal chaos continent. Other than cultivating the god Dao, exploring and comprehending the starry sky, she did not seem to have any hobbies. She did not care about appearances, nor did she care about her reputation, nor did she have any interest in the relationship. She was like a lotus flower that stood aloof from the world, fresh and elegant, causing others to only admire her from afar and not profane her. Such a peerless genius with such a unique temperament was naturally the object of admiration and respect of countless young men in the entire primal chaos continent. Who knew how many young geniuses Pan Ruo saw Pan Ruo? She met Pan-Ruo God Emperor Kenshin Long Tian. In Ruo was a god Pan-Ruo god emperor god Pan god 7. The more than 20 ancient clans on the primal chaos continent were visited by him one by one and defeated one by one in the name of sparring. Pan-Ruo did not care about fame and glory, but Kenshin's rise was too shocking. His fame was too great. The 9 peerless geniuses who were as famous as her were all defeated by the sword god. She was the only one who did not spar with him. Kenshin's fame became greater and greater. There were many busybodies in the world who compared her to Kenshin, calling them the two of them the peerless god kings. Moreover, in the rumors and slanders that filled the sky, she and the god of swords were said to be a match made in heaven, and they were incomparably compatible. Only a peerless god emperor like Kenshin was worthy of Pan-Ruo, and only a peerless goddess like Pan-Ruo was worthy of Kenshin. Kenshin challenged the 9 divine kings and defeated countless senior experts and clan experts, but he did not attack Pan-Ruo. That was because he had fallen in love with Pan-Ruo. Pan-Ruo had always been secretive about her whereabouts. She traveled the world and did not meet Kenshin. That was also because she had feelings for Kenshin. Such rumors and slanders were widely spread in the primal chaos continent. Everyone knew about them. These rumors and slanders even spread out of the primal chaos continent and to other continents. Everyone thought that these rumors and slanders that damaged the reputation of Kenshin and Pan-Ruo would be cleared up by them sooner or later. But no one thought that Kenshin was cold and aloof. He was obsessed with Shinto and Sword Dao. He turned a deaf ear to these rumors and did not care about them at all. At the beginning, Pan-Ruo could also be indifferent and ignore them. But as the years passed, the rumors were gradually accepted by the world. Kenshin did not say anything, nor did he have any intention of clearing up the rumors. Thus Pan-Ruo began to worry. She could no longer maintain a pure and refined attitude. She began to doubt, hesitate and guess. Kenshin challenged almost all the experts and geniuses, but he did not come to find her, nor did he have any intention of challenging her. Could it be that the rumors were true? Kenshin was interested in her? Moreover, the rumors had been spreading for decades. With Kenshin's aloof personality, if he was not interested in her, he would have refuted and cleared up the rumors. Since Kenshin did not say anything, could it be that he admitted that he liked her? Just like that, Pan-Ruo began to worry. She was afraid that Kenshin would challenge her, but she also looked forward to seeing Kenshin in person. At that time she had not met Kenshin. She did not know what kind of person Kenshin was, let alone have any feelings for him. Perhaps she could not stand the rumors and wanted to see Kenshin as soon as possible to get a definite answer. Or perhaps, being admired by a peerless genius like Kenshin made her heart waver, giving rise to a trace of anticipation and joy. In short, after waiting for a few years, she saw that Kenshin did not show up. Instead, he was busy building up his forces in the heavenly mountain region. She could not help but show up. That was the first time she saw Kenshin. In all fairness, Kenshin's peerless talent and aptitude to become a peak divine king in a few hundred years had already made her feel inferior. But when she saw that Kenshin, who was praised by the world, was indeed handsome, heroic and aloof, she could not help but feel her heart palpitate. At that moment she suddenly felt that besides cultivation and the stars, there were other things in the world that were worth pursuing. In the entire god realm, looking at the billions of heroes in the 5 continents and 4 seas, only Kenshin could catch her eye. It made her feel inferior. After she met Kenshin, the two of them looked at each other in the sky above Heavenly Sword Mountain for a long time, but neither of them said anything. In the end, it was Pan-Ruo who calmed her complicated emotions and pretended to be calm as she asked, "Kenshin, you challenged all the genius divine kings and seniors, but you did not challenge me. Are you looking down on me and purposely ignoring me?" Kenshin did not answer her question. He only said one sentence in an indifferent tone. "You have already lost." Chapter 43-44. Both Kenshin and Mingyu did not expect that Pan-Ruo would suddenly reveal her cards and ask Kenshin to choose one of the two. Mingyu's attitude had always been firm. She loved Kenshin deeply and treated him as half of her life, treating him as her most precious treasure. No matter what Kenshin wanted to do, she would not oppose or obstruct him. She would only support and follow him. Even if Kenshin treated her as family and never thought of marrying her or becoming Dao companions with her, she did not have any complaints. As long as she could stay by Kenshin's side, she would be satisfied. As for Kenshin, after becoming a peak divine king, he focused on comprehending the heavenly Tao. He only wanted to seek higher breakthroughs and peek into the realms above the divine way. He was not ignorant about the feelings between men and women. He just chose to ignore and give up. Pan Ruo's sudden confession forced him to make a choice and put him in a difficult position. No matter what choice he made, one of them would be hurt. He tried to persuade Pan Ruo and explained to her that he treated Mingyu as family and Pan Ruo as a good friend. He had never thought about the feelings between men and women. However, Pan Ruo did not believe his explanation and asked him if he wanted to kill two birds with one stone. Of course, this was nonsense. Kenshin denied it. However, since things had reached this point, Pan Ruo had no way out. Even if it did not matter who married Kenshin, she only wanted Kenshin to choose between her and Mingyu, who could stay in Heavenly Sword Mountain and who should leave. Pan Ruo gave in and did not force Kenshin to choose a Dao companion. However, only one of them could stay. This made it difficult for Kenshin to choose. Kenshin's persuasion was useless. In the end, he was forced to make a decision. The answer? Everyone knew. Of course, it was Mingyu who stayed and accompanied Kenshin forever. Pan Ruo left Heavenly Sword Mountain dejectedly with endless disappointment, sadness, anger, and humiliation. Decades of painstaking effort, the only time in his life when his heart palpitated, was all poured into the sword god. In order to obtain Kenshin's approval and love, she almost changed her nature and views. She did many things that went against her heart. She had already let go of her pride and reputation, all for the sake of capturing the sword god's heart. But in the end, she ended up in such a miserable state. Not only did he fail to win Kenshin's heart, but he also became the laughingstock of the world. Her once lofty and holy reputation had also fallen apart, becoming a laughingstock. After leaving Heavenly Sword Mountain, Pan Ruo lived in seclusion for many years to calm her mind. It was only after she calmed down that she came to a realization. She gradually let go of everything and extinguished the last trace of her feelings. She didn't want to do anything against her will anymore, and she didn't want to please anyone. Only with great power and influence would one be able to strengthen oneself. Love was nothing but an illusion. It was ridiculous. From then on, Hanya swore to sever her 7 emotions and 6 desires, to sever her emotions and heart, and to only bitterly cultivate the divine way. Kenshin had once taught her that only with a strong will and a clear mind would one be able to break through to the peak. She finally understood and believed those words. It was because Kenshin had done so that he could become a peak divine king in a few hundred years. Pan Ruo had stayed at Heavenly Sword Mountain and followed Kenshin for decades. She had treated it as a trial for her to enter the world. She had treated it as a mortal tribulation. After passing this tribulation, it was as if she had been reborn and found a new direction in life. Therefore, after cultivating in seclusion for decades, Pan Ruo finally broke through to the peak and became the 6th peak divine king. Of course, Pan Ruo's hard work and determination was one of the reasons why she could become a peak divine king. The other reason was because of Kenshin's guidance and teachings. However, the emotionless Pan Ruo chose to ignore this point. She no longer remembered Kenshin's kindness and only left a trace of hatred in her heart. Later on, the sword god explored the starry skies outside the realm and obtained a supreme treasure by chance. The supreme treasure contained the secrets and power above the divine king realm. It guided the connection between the divine way and the heavenly way. In other words, it was very likely that Kenshin relied on that supreme treasure to surpass the divine king realm and control the power of the heavenly way. After the news spread, it attracted the attention of many experts and factions in the divine realm. They all tried to seize it. After many pursuits, attacks and battles, the various factions and experts fell one after another. However, they were still unable to defeat Kenshin. Later on, under the leadership of the 4 peak divine kings, the various factions and experts began to form a secret alliance. It was worth mentioning that before Pan Ruo became a peak divine king, she was friends with Dao Xingyun and the Netherworld Divine King. After Dao Xingyun, Azura, Netherworld and Lu Jiang formed a secret alliance, they personally persuaded Pan Ruo to join forces and attack Kenshin. The reason they gave was very good. Kenshin was so heartless that he hurt Pan Ruo so deeply that she became the laughingstock of the world. This grudge had to be avenged no matter what. It was very difficult for her to defeat Kenshin alone. Only when the 5 of them joined forces could they defeat Kenshin. Not to mention that they could seize the supreme treasure of the heavenly way, just the thought of Pan Ruo defeating Kenshin and telling him, "It's not that you abandoned me, it's that you're not worthy of me." Originally, Pan Ruo was heartless and did not want to be entangled with Kenshin. She rejected the Four-Peak Divine King's suggestion. However, Dao Xingyun and the Netherworld Divine King persuaded her repeatedly and incited her many times. In the end, Pan Ruo's obsession with Kenshin was too deep. Her resolve wavered and she agreed to the alliance. Of course, she wanted to defeat Kenshin and avenge her previous humiliation. However, she never thought of killing Kenshin after obtaining the supreme treasure. The Four-Peak Divine King's thoughts were vicious, but they could not tell her. In the end, there was the great battle of the gods in the void. The Five-Peak Divine Kings joined forces and attacked Kenshin and his subordinates. It shook the heavens and dyed the galaxy red. During the great battle, everyone found out that the supreme treasure came from the depths of the void. It was divided into two items. One was the Eternal Heavenly Book, and the other was the Heaven-Punishing Formation. The Four-Peak Divine Kings successfully obtained the Eternal Heavenly Book, but the Heaven-Punishing Formation was still in Kenshin's hands. Pan Ruo thought that the great battle would be over after defeating or capturing Kenshin. However, Kenshin refused to surrender. The Four-Peak Divine Kings did not hold back either. They wanted to kill Kenshin at all costs. In the end, Kenshin and his subordinates died. The Heaven-Punishing Formation also disappeared without a trace. The Four-Peak Divine Kings were relieved. They were pleasantly surprised but also a little regretful. However, Pan Ruo's feelings were the most complicated. She even felt some regret. However, all of this was unknown. Kenshin's death represented the end of an era. The Five-Peak Divine Kings joined forces to study and comprehend the Eternal Heavenly Book. As expected, they had shocking gains. After they divided the 5 continents and ruled the divine world, they broke through the realm of divine kings within 100 years and reached the higher realm of God Emperor. The 5 God Emperors received enlightenment from the Eternal Heavenly Book. They were no longer satisfied with controlling the divine world and dividing the world. They agreed to leave the divine world and head into the depths of the void to search for the heaven-punishing formation and the secrets of the heavenly way. 100 years later, the 5 God Emperors indeed made a shocking discovery in the depths of the void. From then on, they stayed in the depths of the void, constantly gathering troops and resources. However, they never returned to the divine world. Bookhouse Reading Website. Chapter 43-45. The past between Kenshin and Xianxia had been circulating in the Primal Chaos continent for many years and everyone knew about it. The majority of people did not know the specific details and process, but they knew the general idea. So when Kenshin and Xianxia met again, the conversation and atmosphere was a little strange, which was reasonable. Ji Tianxing stared at Xianxia. His expression was calm, neither happy nor angry, and said indifferently, "If you keep emphasizing something, it means that you have not truly let it go. If you have truly let it go, why would you keep it in your heart? Furthermore, the harder the shell, the easier it is to break." These words had another meaning. Xianxia frowned, a trace of anger flashing past her eyes. He was clearly exposing her. She had not forgotten what happened back then and had always been brooding about it. She was just pretending to forget and pretending to be indifferent. But Ji Tianxing's words made her unable to refute. "Damn it! You are still so harsh and heartless." Xianxia glared fiercely at Ji Tianxing and did not want to continue this topic. "Today, I am not here to reminisce with you. I am here to take your life." Ji Tianxing was not in a hurry to make a move. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "With your scheming and shrewdness and your understanding of me, it is not difficult for you to guess that I have stepped into the Primal Chaos continent ahead of time. But how can you be sure that I will not show myself after reaching the Primal Chaos continent, and will immediately come to the Sky Sword Mountain? You have mobilized so many elite troops to ambush here. This is a huge gamble. If the gamble is wrong, you will definitely suffer heavy losses." Xianxia raised the corner of her mouth and sneered, "As the saying goes, know yourself and know your enemy, and you will be victorious in every battle. Regarding your nature, I naturally know it like the back of my hand. Although you are cold, harsh, and heartless, this is your cave. You have been reborn, and the first time you have returned to the Primal Chaos continent, you will definitely come here to take a look." When she said these words, Xianxia seemed to be very confident, as though she was sure that she had Ji Tianxing. The truth was indeed so. Her plan was very successful and the timing was also very accurate. At this time, Ji Tianxing had just arrived at the Primal Chaos land. His whereabouts had not been exposed and the news had not spread. He hadn't subdued any of the ancient clans or top forces, nor had he found any of his former subordinates. It could be said that he was bare-handed and weak. As for Panruo, she had over 100 god kings and 30,000 elite divine lords with her. If she still couldn't kill Kenshin, then there was no need for her to struggle or hope. To put it simply, this was her only chance to kill Kenshin and protect the chaotic continent. It was only because she knew Kenshin well that she dared to make such a bold gamble. As it turned out, she had made the right bet. Tianxing was not really invincible. Being surrounded by Hanya and the 30,000 elite soldiers, of course he did not have the confidence to escape. However, his expression was calm and collected. No matter what, he could not weaken Kenshin's reputation and make a joke out of himself in front of Hanya. Hanya, compared to Azura, Netherworld and Dao Xingyun, it is indeed admirable for you to have such courage and make such a decision. You have also grown a lot. However, have you ever thought that you have gathered almost half of your forces to deal with me today? Once the plan fails, what are the consequences? Hanya snorted at this and sneered with disdain. You too, master and disciple, even if you have great abilities, you will not be able to escape. Today you will definitely die. This emperor could kill you once back then, and today I can kill you a second time. Tianxing raised his eyebrows and said with a playful tone, although you participated in that battle back then, I remember very clearly that when I was surrounded, there were only those 4 bastards. You seemed to be watching the battle from the side and could not bear to kill me? Preposterous. Hanya was furious, her beautiful face was cold as she shouted, this emperor and the 4 god emperors worked together to kill you. Why can't I bear to kill you? Even if this emperor did not make a move back then, it was because I was stopped by your subordinate protector Yijian. That year Kenshin had 2 great protectors under him. One was Protector Yijian and the other was Protector Yijian. Both of them had 9th level God King realm strength. Tianxing looked at Hanya with a smile that did not look like a smile and asked back. That year you were a peak God King and Protector Yijian only had 9th stage realm strength. How could he stop you? You. Hanya was exposed and she was a little angry as she rebuked. This emperor can't be bothered to talk nonsense with you, draw your sword. Saying that, Hanya drew out 2 golden swords that were as bright as the sun and started to accumulate god power, preparing to make a move. Tianxing still had no intention to make a move and ignored Hanya's anger and killing intent as he continued to ask. I will ask you one last time, I hope you will think clearly before you answer. That year were you the same as those 4 bastards, not giving up until you killed me? If you have the intention to kill, is it for the treasure or for revenge? This time, Tianxing's expression and tone were extremely solemn and grave. Seeing his expression and hearing such a sharp question, Hanya couldn't help but go into a daze. If it was her usual character, she would definitely answer yes without any hesitation to express her hatred and coldness towards Kenshin. But not knowing why, she actually hesitated and fell silent. She had hated Kenshin for 1,000 years and originally thought that after Kenshin had fallen, she would gradually forget about this matter. But reality had proven that some people, some things, some memories, even 1,000 years would not be able to erase them. And several decades ago, when she first heard the news of Kenshin's rebirth from the other god emperor's mouth, other than shock and disbelief, there was also a sliver of relief. It seemed that Kenshin's rebirth had reduced the guilt in her heart by more than half. Of course, these were all very emotional thoughts which were hidden in the bottom of her heart. It was until now, when she saw Kenshin standing 10,000 feet away with her own eyes, looking even more spirited, even more mysterious and powerful than that year, her thoughts became somewhat complicated. That was why she changed her cold and indifferent personality and became angry at Kenshin's words. And now, Kenshin's expression and tone were sincere as he stared at her and asked this question. How should she answer? If she answered yes, it would naturally be an answer against her heart, and Kenshin would definitely be very disappointed and completely disheartened towards her, no longer caring about their old friendship. In reality, Hanya had always known that even when Kenshin had chosen Mingyu and forced her to leave Heavenly Sword Mountain. However, the sword god had never blamed her, nor did he have the slightest bit of resentment. Even during the Battle of the Gods, when she and the 4 peak god kings attacked Kenshin together, Kenshin intentionally avoided her and did not harm her. This was because Kenshin still cared about their old friendship. Others might not understand Kenshin, But she knew that Kenshin was a person who valued relationships and old friendships the most despite his cold and emotionless appearance. It was also because of this that she successfully predicted that Kenshin would secretly come to the Heavenly Sword Mountain ruins. Even though the two of them were on opposite sides, she still believed that Kenshin still cared about their old friendship. She did not want Kenshin to be completely disheartened, and even more so, she did not want Kenshin to ignore her or treat her as an enemy. Chapter 43-46. As a matter of fact, Ji Tianxing was right. The more Pan Ruo emphasized something, the more it proved that she cared about it. The harder it looked, the easier it was to break. Others only saw her cold, indifferent and aloof attitude, as well as her indifference, disdain and hostility towards Kenshin. But no one knew that if Kenshin looked at her affectionately and sincerely told her that he finally understood, regretted his decision back then, and was willing to become partners with her, then her heart's defenses would completely collapse and all her pretenses would be removed. As for what she would do, even she didn't know. But one thing was for sure, she would no longer have the courage to attack Kenshin. Everyone said that men were the most infatuated and women were the most affectionate. When men were infatuated, they would die without regrets. And once they let it go, they would truly let it go. But women were different. When facing the person they once loved, even if they experienced the twists and turns of love and hate, after time passed they still couldn't forget. If the other party confessed to her and expressed his feelings, she would most likely forgive him and reconcile with him again. Of course, this only applied to some people and it definitely didn't represent everyone. What was even more coincidental was that Pan Ruo, such a peerless and world-renowned heaven's favorite, had such a temperament. She was arrogant, indifferent on the outside and proud on the inside. Even today in this world, only Kenshin could enter her eyes. Regardless of whether it was in terms of emotions or cultivation, she was a somewhat stubborn person. So she refused to answer Ji Tianxing's question. What's the point of saying all this now? What happened back then is already in the past. Today this emperor must get rid of you. Otherwise, this emperor's 1,000 years of foundation will be destroyed by your hands, and countless soldiers will suffer. As she spoke, Pan Ruo once again clenched her golden swords, preparing to attack. But Ji Tianxing raised his hand to stop her and asked, Pan Ruo, you are already a god emperor and have grasped the power of the heavenly Tao. Why would you care about the primal chaos continent? The small god realm can no longer accommodate a great god like you. Shouldn't your goal be to explore the end of the divine Tao, grasp even more power and live as long as the heavens? Shouldn't you be more concerned about that thing in outer space? Speaking of the mystery of the gray fog in the outer space, Xianxia immediately became much more vigilant. She frowned and snorted coldly. What are you talking about? I don't understand. Ji Tianxing smiled and said, you guys are desperately trying to plunder the cultivation resources of the god realm as if you're trying to fill a bottomless pit. Since I've conquered the boundless heaven continent, the reincarnation island and the firmament continent, and I've also destroyed several incarnations of the God Emperor, do you think I don't know the inside story? Xianxia fell silent again. She also knew that this matter could not be hidden from Kenshin. Moreover, it was only a matter of time before Kenshin ventured into the depths of space and encountered the true bodies of the 5 God Emperors. At that time it would be the true day of the final battle. Ji Tianxing thought for a moment and then said, Xianxia, how about this? You can take away all the elites and resources and continue to invest in that matter. Leave the primal chaos continent to me. I promise not to harm any of the soldiers and citizens. What do you think? If the two of them were evenly matched and in a stalemate, this condition could be considered. Ji Tianxing only wanted the primal chaos continent. He would not harm the soldiers under Xianxia's command, nor would he oppress the citizens, nor would he plunder the cultivation resources. Xianxia could also put all her strength into the research of the gray fog. But unfortunately, Xianxia frowned fiercely. She only felt that this suggestion was ridiculous. The 2 marshals and several generals behind her all looked at Ji Tianxing in confusion, and then revealed a mocking smile. Kenshin, are you still living in a dream? With your current situation, what qualifications do you have to negotiate with the God Emperor? Hee. Kenshin, we respect you as a senior expert, but you can't be too arrogant and treat us as if we don't exist. Kenshin, I think you should first consider whether to be besieged to death by us, or surrender to the God Emperor. Xianxia raised her hand, stopping the marshals and divine generals under her command. Even if she and Kenshin were enemies, she understood Kenshin's pride. These marshals and generals did not have the qualifications to mock Kenshin. She looked at Ji Tianqing and said in a low and stern voice, "Long Tian, this emperor will give you one last chance. Do you want to fight or surrender?" Ji Tianqing pretended to consider and asked, "If I surrender, you won't kill me?" Hearing those words, Hanya was stunned. She had never thought that the aloof, cold and emotionless sword god would actually ask such a question. This was too abnormal, right? Where is your pride as Kenshin? Surrender? That's not like you. While Pan Ruo was in a daze, Ji Tianqing finally moved. Shua. With his fastest speed, he put the white dragon into the god-slaying warship. At the same time, he took out the primal chaos bell with his left hand and the sword of burial of heaven with his right hand. He turned around and attacked the thousands of soldiers. Surrender? These two words did not exist in his life. It was also impossible for him to fight Hanya and the 30,000 soldiers to the end. There was only one answer, and that was to break out of the encirclement. Yes, it could also be understood as running away. In this situation, only a fool would not run. Heavenly Dragon World / Might shakes the world. Ji Tianqing took out the primal chaos bell with his left hand and released a violent divine power that fiercely attacked the thousands of soldiers in front of him. He waved the sword of burial of heaven with his right hand and slashed out a 10,000-meter-long golden dragon blade light that slashed into the crowd. Hanya, the two marshals and the generals did not react in time. They did not have the time to stop or block it. The thousands of elite soldiers were on high alert, ready to fight at any time. When the giant divine bell and the earth-shattering golden dragon blade light slashed down, they did not hesitate to use their divine powers and spells to counterattack. Boom. Bam. 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 The sky full of divine powers collided, creating a deafening sound that reverberated between heaven and earth. Violent and devastating shockwaves spread out in all directions, destroying the mountains within a radius of 10,000 miles and turning the boundless forest into scorched earth and ruins. At least 1,000 elite soldiers were suppressed by the primal chaos bell on the spot. If they were not killed, they were injured. The 30,000-meter-long golden dragon greatsword slashed into the crowd, causing blood, flesh, and divine light to fill the sky. A gap was forcibly torn open in the encirclement of the soldiers. Whoosh! Before anyone could react, Ji Tianqing had turned into a white dot of light and teleported through the gap, appearing 10,000 miles away. Seeing this scene, Hanya's pupils shrank and a hint of fear flashed across her eyes. The two marshals and the generals were even more shocked as they exclaimed in disbelief. This is Kenshin's true strength? He